Hello there, and welcome to Bone Age. My name is Thomas, and tonight we're drifting back to a world on the edge of disappearance. 12,000 years ago, the Earth was in the transition. Vast ice sheets that had blanketed continents for tens of thousands of years were melting. Rivers swelled with cold torrents, seas crept higher and higher, and the edges of familiar landscapes dissolved into water. It was a time when humanity was just beginning to experiment with permanence, the first fragile steps toward farming, settlement, and culture. But this delicate beginning, this spark of civilization, was nearly drowned. Imagine standing where dry land once stretched for miles, only to watch it vanish beneath the horizon of advancing waves. Entire valleys became seabeds, shores swallowed villages, and for people who had lived for generations on coastlines now gone, it must have felt like the earth itself had turned against them. Across the globe, cultures would carry fragments of this memory, in myths of a flood so great it seemed to swallow the world. For centuries, people thought those were only stories, but the evidence written in stone and water tells us otherwise. There really was a flood, vast, sudden, and transformative, and it very nearly erased us. That is what we'll explore tonight. How the great flood of 12,000 years ago reshaped the earth, tested humanity, and carved itself into our myths, our DNA, and our imagination. Not as allegory, but as lived experience, the waters rising, the land slipping away, and fragile human bands forced to choose between migration or extinction. Before we begin, if you enjoy drifting off with us into these forgotten realms, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It helps more wanderers find their way here. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? I'd love to know how far these stories travel, and how many night skies we share together. So settle in, slow your breathing. Picture the distant horizon of a world not yet fully ours. Because before we can speak of survival, of memory, and of myth, we must first return to the age before the waters rose, when the world was still icebound, and the flood was only a shadow on the horizon. The earth 12,000 years ago was wrapped in a silence that is hard to imagine today. The air was sharper, colder, carrying with it the fine dust of glaciers that ground mountains into powder. If you could have walked across the northern continents then, each step would have crunched with frost, each breath like swallowing shards of glass. Towering walls of ice dominated the horizon, their blue-white surfaces reflecting light in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. A mile-thick sheet covered much of North America. Another smothered Europe and Scandinavia, while Asia too was bound in frozen weight. The world groaned under the burden of so much ice, the crust of the planet itself pressed down, valleys flattened, mountains hidden, rivers redirected by the glacial grip. Even now, long after the thaw, the earth is still slowly rising back, like a body unbending from centuries of strain. But not all of the world was locked in this frozen stillness. With so much water trapped in the ice, the seas had retreated, falling hundreds of feet below the levels we know today. The shape of the continents was different, their coastlines stretched far outward into plains that no longer exist. Places we know as islands were once bound together into superlands, and fertile valleys now drowned beneath salt water were green and alive with life. If you stood on the cliffs of Britain, you would not have seen the restless waters of the English Channel. Instead, you would have looked out across a rolling plain, Doggerland, a land of rivers, forests, and grassy fields that connected Britain to the rest of Europe. Herds of red deer moved like living storms across its meadows. Wild horses kicked up dust that drifted into the cold air, and aurochs, massive wild cattle, grazed in shadows of ancient trees. People lived here too, small bands whose fires flickered at dusk, whose children played in the shallows of rivers now long buried beneath the North Sea. Far away in the east, another lost world thrived, where shallow waters now cover the sundered shelf. What we call the scattered islands of Indonesia and Malaysia were once joined as a vast supercontinent. Imagine traveling on foot through what is now ocean, from the jungles of Vietnam all the way to the forests of Borneo, never seeing a shoreline, only endless stretches of trees heavy with the calls of birds no longer alive. In the Persian Gulf basin, where turquoise waters now lap at desert coasts, a wide green valley unfolded, cut through by rivers dotted with lakes. This was perhaps one of humanity's early gardens, a place of abundance where fish darted in clear shallows and plants grew rich in fertile soil. Families gathered at these waters, learned which roots to store and which seeds to scatter. Some scholars believe it may have been one of the cradles of farming, a beginning written in soil that would later vanish under the sea. These coasts and valleys, these hidden plains and bridges, were the true heartlands of our ancestors. Here, at the edges of ice and ocean, humanity found the richest hunting grounds, the most abundant rivers, the widest pastures. Imagine walking across Beringia, the 1,000-mile grassland that once stretched between Siberia and Alaska, binding Asia to the Americas. It was not a narrow crossing, but a sweeping plain filled with mammoths, musk oxen, and herds of caribou so large they seemed like rivers of muscle and breath moving across the land. Families followed them, step by step, carrying fire, tools, and stories into new worlds. That plain is now hidden beneath the Bering Strait, but it carried some of the first people into the Americas, reshaping human history forever. The world before the flood was alive with possibility. It was a place of extraordinary abundance, but also of extraordinary fragility. Survival here required an intimacy with the land that is almost impossible to imagine in the modern world. Picture waking at dawn to a sky pale with mist, the air heavy with the smell of wood smoke from a fire that had never been allowed to die through the night. A child stirs beside you, wrapped in furs, while elders whisper quietly, planning the day's hunt. Outside, the frost cracks underfoot as men and women move together, following the tracks of reindeer pressed into the frozen ground. Their voices are hushed, for silence is part of survival. Every sound carries in the cold air, the cry of a raven, the snapping of twigs, the distant thunder of hooves from unseen herds. Hunting was not only necessity but ritual. Spears tipped with stone or bone were shaped over hours of work, sharpened edges flaked with precision, hafts bound tightly with sinew. To bring down a bison or a mammoth was not a solitary act, it was a dance of cooperation. Some drove the animal toward hidden spears. Others waited in ambush, the outcome uncertain, the risk immense. Bones would splinter, meat would smoke over fires, hides would become shelter. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. And yet, even amid this struggle, there were beginnings of something new. People were not only hunting and gathering, they were experimenting. Along the rivers of the Fertile Crescent, wild wheat and barley were gathered, and perhaps by chance or by curiosity, their seeds scattered where they grew again. In East Asia, rice was slowly coaxed from wild grasses. In Africa, yams and sorghum began to be stored, tended, and cultivated. These were not yet farms in the sense we know them, but they were steps toward it, flickers of agriculture, sparks of permanence. Imagine a woman kneeling in soil, her fingers pressing seeds into the earth, not only to eat today, but to return to in seasons yet to come. That gesture, repeated quietly across thousands of years, was the foundation of civilizations. Still, permanence was a fragile dream in this time. Most families lived as they always had, following herds, moving with seasons, sheltering where they could. Their homes were simple but ingenious, domes of wood and hide, caves carved into the earth, huts of mammoth bones draped with furs. Fires burned at their centers, never allowed to fade. In that firelight, shadows danced on walls, and those shadows became stories. Perhaps it was here, in the glow of flame, that the first myths were born. Stories to explain the cold, the stars, the endless presence of ice. The world of the Ice Age was a paradox, immense in its scale, intimate in its detail. To look down upon it from the height of the sky, you would have seen two halves of earth in tension, the north white and frozen, gleaming like broken glass across continents, the south green and alive, with bands of humans and animals clustered along fertile rivers and coasts. Between them, the oceans pulled back like a breath held too long, revealing hidden highways and plains that made the world seem connected, whole, and immense under the same sky. But even then change was stirring. The ice was no longer eternal. Cracks opened in its surface, meltwater pouring into rivers that swelled and twisted through valleys. Lakes formed at the edges of glaciers, held back by fragile dams of ice that one day would collapse in cataclysmic floods. Inch by inch, century by century, the seas were rising. To those alive at the time, the change may have seemed slow. A shoreline creeping, a marsh spreading, where once there had been meadow. But across generations the pace quickened. The plains of Doggerland began to sink, the Persian Gulf Valley filled, the Sunda Shelf fragmented into islands, and the people who had built their lives in these places were forced to move, to abandon, to adapt. The world before the flood was a promise and a warning. It gave humanity the space to thrive, the abundance to experiment, the chance to kindle the first sparks of culture and community. But it also carried in its very design the seeds of its own end. The seas that had retreated would return. The plains that had nurtured the first settlements would vanish. The bridges that had connected continents would sink into salt water. It was a world balanced on the edge of transformation, and its beauty was as temporary as frost beneath the morning sun. And so, as the centuries turned and the ice began to melt in earnest, the shadow of water grew ever closer. What seemed eternal began to dissolve, and humanity, perched at the threshold of discovery and survival, would soon be tested by a flood vast enough to almost erase it. It began not with thunder, nor with a single catastrophic moment, but with warmth that crept quietly into the world. Around 12,000 years ago, the grip of the younger Dryas, that strange return of glacial cold, gave way. The winds shifted, the air softened, and global temperatures spiked with sudden intensity. What had been an age of ice loosened almost overnight in geological time, like a frozen river beginning to stir beneath the spring sun. The vast ice sheets that had locked away oceans began to collapse, not inch by inch, but in surges so violent that the earth's rivers swelled with torrents no human eye had ever seen before. The change was everywhere. Imagine standing at the foot of a glacier that had loomed for centuries, its walls glittering blue in the pale sun, and hearing it groan like a living thing. Cracks spread like lightning across its surface. Whole cliffs of ice calved away, crashing into the valleys below, with a roar that rolled like thunder for miles. Water, once bound in crystalline stillness, rushed free, tumbling into rivers, pouring into lakes, surging toward the seas. In that moment, the sound of the earth itself was the sound of collapse, the grinding of ice, the rush of meltwater, the echo of valleys filling with floods. This was Meltwater Pulse 1A, one of the most abrupt rises in sea level ever recorded. In less than 5 centuries, a heartbeat in geological terms, the oceans rose by as much as 400 feet. Coastlines shifted not in generations, but within lifetimes. Imagine your children being born in a camp set by a riverbank, only to grow old in a world where that same ground lay beneath the waves. For the people who lived in the lowlands, it must have seemed as though the earth itself was dissolving beneath them. Hunting grounds disappeared into marsh, familiar paths were swallowed, villages that had stood for generations vanished in a matter of years. The air itself would have carried signs of change, heavy with the scent of thawing soil, thick with moisture from meltwater storms, skies often dimmed by the mist, rising off rivers swollen beyond their banks. Animals, too, were unsettled. Herds shifted their migrations as grasslands drowned, forcing hunters to follow them into unfamiliar territories. Birds wheeled above new wetlands, while fish surged into estuaries that had only recently been dry valleys. For the people who watched this transformation, it was as though the land itself were betraying memory. What was once certain, a familiar plain, a sacred site, a trusted river crossing, could vanish within the span of a single season. Entire regions were redrawn. Doggerland, which had been a broad, fertile expanse binding Britain to Europe, began to shrink. First the marshes expanded, then the rivers widened, and finally the sea itself came creeping inland, filling low basins, turning hunting camps into tidal inlets. Families who had returned year after year to the same fishing spots were forced to abandon them, moving ever inland, always chasing solid ground. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf fractured into islands, and communities that had once traded across continuous forests now found themselves separated by widening seas. The Persian Gulf Valley, once lush and green, began to fill like a basin, its rivers swelling into a widening inland sea that would never recede. For those alive at the time, this was not an abstract shift in climate. It was lived catastrophe. Imagine waking to the familiar rhythm of waves at the shore, only to realize they reached farther inland each dawn. Picture tending a fire outside your shelter and hearing in the distance a deep rumble that was not thunder, but ice collapsing, sending floods downriver that swept away forests like reeds. To live through this moment was to live through a world being rewritten, its lines redrawn in water. The migrations began slowly but soon became relentless. Families packed what they could carry, skins, tools, precious seeds, and moved toward higher ground. Clans that had lived for generations along coasts found themselves climbing ridges, pushing into valleys where other groups already hunted and gathered. Conflict was inevitable. Territories overlapped, resources grew scarce, and once isolated bands were forced into tense contact. Some merged, forging new communities. Others clashed, leaving behind traces of violence in bones, fractured by spear points, and skulls scarred by blunt blows. But more often, survival demanded cooperation. Fires were shared, knowledge of inland plans exchanged, rivers navigated together as old maps of memory failed. The psychological toll must have been immense. The ocean was no longer a boundary, but a pursuer. At night, elders told stories of places that no longer existed, valleys where mammoths once grazed, cliffs that had sunk beneath waves, sacred groves drowned in silence. Children grew up knowing only fragments, their earliest memories tied not to permanence but to loss. To them the world was not stable. It was shifting, fragile, and dangerous, and yet, Within this trauma lay the seeds of adaptation. What science tells us is stark. Global temperatures jumped, ice sheets collapsed, and sea levels surged in a geological instant. But science cannot capture the human weight of that change. Imagine a mother teaching her child to dig for roots in soil still soft from the retreat of ice, whispering the names of plants that had grown only recently where glaciers once lay. Imagine the feel of wet earth clinging to your hands, the taste of cold water from a stream fed by melting snowfields, the way the air smelled different each season. Once barren and sharp, now thick with new growth and decay. To live then was to witness the earth in motion, a planet shedding its frozen skin and revealing something unfamiliar beneath. The scale of water's return is almost beyond comprehension. 400 feet of sea level rise is enough to redraw entire continents. Rivers once shallow enough to ford grew into raging torrents. Lakes spilled over their banks, merging with the sea. Estuaries surged inland, cutting deep into plains, and beneath these rising waters lay the ruins of entire landscapes, homes, hunting grounds, the very bones of history. The drowned coasts became tombs of memory, sealed beneath salt and tide. In the Americas, massive glacial lakes formed and collapsed in sudden outbursts, releasing walls of water that thundered across plains, scouring the land, tearing up forests, and leaving behind canyons still visible today. The Missoula floods carved deep scars into what is now the Pacific Northwest, reshaping valleys in a matter of days. For those who lived nearby, the sound of these floods must have been like the world ending, a roar so loud it shook the bones, walls of water racing faster than a horse could run, sweeping away everything in their path. And yet, even amid devastation, humanity endured. People learned to move more quickly, to build the temporary shelters that could be abandoned without sorrow, to rely on rivers not as boundaries, but as lifelines. Knowledge spread rapidly in these times, which roots to eat, which highlands offered safety, which valleys would soon be swallowed. Perhaps it was here, in this era of forced migration, that the first deep sense of memory and myth took shape. The flood was not only water, it was story. A story told to remind children not to trust the sea, not to linger too long in the lowlands, not to forget that the earth itself could rise against them. The sudden meltdown was more than climate, more than geography, more than science. It was the sound of a species almost erased, the echo of families climbing higher each year, the salt of tears mixing with salt of waves, the weight of a planet reshaping itself in front of human eyes. And it was only the beginning, for as the waters advanced, as the glaciers groaned and broke, as rivers swelled into seas, humanity would learn the hardest lesson of all. That survival was not just a matter of endurance, but of transformation. The oceans crept forward, not with the violence of a single moment, but with a relentless patience that no wall of wood or stone could ever resist. The land that had been humanity's stage was shrinking, dissolving at the edges, becoming something unfamiliar with each passing season. In one place, a meadow, where red deer once grazed became a marsh, the air thick with gnats and reeds swaying in waterlogged soil. In another, a river valley widened until its banks were swallowed entirely, leaving only the shimmer of a growing inlet that never receded. What had been firm, solid earth became unstable, slippery, and then finally gone. Doggerland, the vast expanse that once connected Britain to the continent, was among the first of these drowned worlds. Imagine standing there as the North Sea pressed inland, swallowing fields and forests that had provided food for generations. Families who had set their shelters along winding rivers found their hearths damp, their fire pits drowned by tides that reached farther each year. The sound of waves would have been constant, once distant, now loud and insistent, rolling closer until even the ground beneath familiar paths grew soft with salt water. There is evidence, buried beneath the silt, of tools left behind, of hearths abandoned. The bones of aurochs and deer lie scattered where water now churns, reminders that this was once a place alive with sound. Hoofbeats thundering, flint striking against stone, laughter carried in the wind, but the sea was patient, and the sea did not stop. What was once a land of abundance is now a seabed, its story hidden beneath the restless grey waves of the North Sea. Far to the south, the Persian Gulf basin told a different story, but with the same ending. Where today the water gleams under the desert sun, there was once a fertile valley threaded with rivers, green with life. Imagine the air there, warm, sweet, with the smell of grasses and flowers, rich with the calls of birds darting between reeds. Here, people may have lingered longer than in other places, experimenting with seeds, building small camps that grew year after year in the same places. And then, slowly but unstoppably, the valley began to fill. The rivers swelled, the marshes deepened, the lakes widened until their waters joined in one great expanse that crept across the land. People must have watched their fields vanish beneath rippling waves, must have marked the days when beloved groves disappeared beneath water. To lose this valley was not just to lose soil, it was to lose memory, ritual, and perhaps the first sparks of farming. When the Persian Gulf became a sea, it buried what may have been one of humanity's earliest gardens. In the Far East, the story repeated. The Sunda Shelf, once a supercontinent of forests and rivers, fractured into scattered islands. Imagine walking through endless green, trees heavy with humidity, vines thick around your ankles, and then watching the ground begin to fragment, rivers widening into straits, valleys filling into lagoons. Families who had once traded and traveled freely across vast land now found themselves separated by stretches of salt water. What had been one world became many. The soundscape changed from the calls of monkeys echoing through continuous forests to the rhythm of waves lapping against new coastlines. Boats may have been fashioned out of necessity, the first attempts at crossing the waters that had divided what had always been whole. The cultural unity of this place shattered, replaced by new beginnings scattered across archipelagos. The Americas too bore scars of this drowned transformation. Massive glacial lakes, swollen beyond measure, collapsed in sudden outbursts. Walls of water rushed across the plains, stripping forests bare, scouring valleys into new shapes. Imagine the roar of such a flood, louder than storms, louder than fire, a sound that would have shaken the ground itself. Trees snapped like twigs, animals swept away in torrents that left only silence in their wake. River systems were rewritten in a single season, their courses bent and reshaped by the sheer force of meltwater. For those who lived along these rivers, the world shifted overnight. Familiar fishing grounds vanished. Crossing points disappeared. Valleys that had once held villages were filled with debris and silt. To witness such a flood was to watch the earth erase itself and redraw the lines anew. Everywhere the map was changing. The coasts retreated, the seas advanced, and the world seemed to grow smaller. To the people alive at the time, this was not a distant concept, but an intimate wound. Camps had to be moved, and then moved again. Trails once known by heart were abandoned. Sacred places marked by stories and ritual sank beneath the waves, leaving only the memory of where they had been. Communities clung to higher ground, watching from ridges as their homelands vanished below, powerless to stop it, powerless even to slow it. The ocean was not a storm to be waited out. It was a tide that would never recede. Imagine the fear of watching your world shrink in every direction. You wake to the sound of gulls calling above a new inlet that did not exist in your childhood. You walk along a path only to find it ends at a cliff where the land has crumbled into the sea. You listen at night to the steady rhythm of waves against the shore, realizing that rhythm is moving closer each season. The ocean itself became a pursuer, chasing people inland, forcing them to abandon everything they had ever known. And yet, there must also have been awe. To see such changes was to witness the planet alive, reshaping itself before human eyes. Glaciers that had held the horizon for centuries now revealed valleys no one had walked before. Forests grew where ice had retreated. Rivers widened into fertile deltas rich with fish. The loss was immense, but so too was the strange abundance that followed in the wake of the flood. Perhaps some saw opportunity in these new landscapes, even as others mourned what was lost. Still, the trauma endured. Myths carried fragments of these memories, echoes of when the seas rose and swallowed the land. Stories told around firelight would preserve the sense of disaster. Waters that covered the earth, gods or spirits who brought floods as punishment or warning, families who survived by climbing to higher ground. These myths were not invented from nothing. They were born of lived experience, of generations forced to move inland as the coasts dissolved around them. The drowned coasts were more than geography. They were an unraveling of identity, of culture, of the human bond to place. To lose a homeland is to lose not only soil and stone, but memory itself. Each bay that filled, each valley that sank, carried away the imprints of footsteps, the echoes of voices, the rhythm of lives that had unfolded there. Entire chapters of human history vanished beneath salt water, leaving only whispers in DNA, only stories carried across generations. And yet humanity endured. Families pressed inland, carrying their memories with them, their rituals, their seeds, their stories. From high ridges they watched the seas expand, and from those ridges they began again. The drowned coasts marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. What had been familiar was gone, but in its place lay new lands, new rivers, new beginnings. The ocean had claimed half the world, but it had not claimed humanity itself. For those who lived through the rising of the seas, the losses were not abstract, not distant, but immediate and intimate. Imagine sitting at the edge of a fire, its embers glowing against the cool night air, and realizing the place where your ancestors had always returned was gone. The shoreline where your grandmother gathered mussels, the meadow where hunters tracked deer, the grove where stories were told at dusk, all of it drowned, erased by water that advanced with a patience no human could resist. The flood was not only a reshaping of Earth's map, it was the undoing of memory, of culture, of belonging itself. Camps that had endured for generations were abandoned almost overnight. A hearth that had burned continuously for decades, stones blackened by smoke, might vanish in a single season beneath the tide. What is left of these people in the record is often silence, breaks where villages should have been, gaps where traditions once continued unbroken. Archaeologists see these interruptions as scattered fragments, a pottery style ending abruptly, tools no longer crafted in the same way, a sudden absence of fire pits in regions where they had long been present. Each absence is a shadow of disaster, a clue that entire communities were forced to leave, or perhaps perished when the waters rose too fast to escape. The trauma cannot be measured in artifacts alone. Picture a mother teaching a child how to weave reeds into a basket, only to find the marsh where those reeds once grew swallowed in brackish tide. Imagine the ache of hunger when fishing grounds turned to open sea, when rivers that once teemed with salmon became salt estuaries too deep to wade. Food sources were lost not one at a time, but in waves, entire ecosystems transformed, leaving families desperate for new ways to survive. Some migrated inland, but the lands they moved into were already occupied. Territories overlapped, tensions flared, and the delicate balance of sharing space fractured under the weight of necessity. Conflict grew more common. Clans pressed into valleys where others had long hunted, sparking disputes over water, pasture, and game. Some of these conflicts left their marks, skeletons showing wounds from spear points, skulls cracked by blunt force, but not all endings were violent. Many groups merged, out of necessity, knitting together different traditions into something new. Languages blended, stories were shared, and survival often meant letting go of old distinctions in order to endure together. Still, every union carried with it the weight of loss, the surrender of sacred places, the fading of dialects, the quiet burial of practices that no longer had ground to stand upon. Populations shrank. Genetic evidence suggests bottlenecks, moments when the diversity of humanity narrowed, when small groups carried the weight of survival for entire regions. Starvation was common, especially where experiments with early cultivation were drowned. In fertile valleys, now under siege, the first fragile steps toward farming were undone. Barley fields that had once been tended along rivers vanished in floods. Rice patches along swampy lowlands disappeared beneath salt. In many regions, people returned to older ways, forced back into pure hunting and gathering after the promise of farming had been washed away. Progress did not move in a straight line. It staggered, stumbled, and in some places it was erased. The regression was not a failure of ingenuity, but a necessity of survival. Imagine carefully storing seed in woven baskets, waiting for the rains, only to see the soil carried off by the flood. Imagine leading animals to graze, only to watch their pasture sink beneath encroaching tides. Faced with this, families returned to what they knew would not fail them: the pursuit of game, the foraging of roots, the gathering of berries in forests that remained above water. It was simpler, but it was safer. Civilization nearly ended before it began, not through war or disease, but through the slow, unstoppable rise of water. The emotional weight of this time must have been immense. People carried with them not just hunger but grief for places lost, for rituals that could no longer be performed, for ancestors buried in lands now drowned beneath the sea. Burial sites, sacred groves, markers of identity were claimed by the tide. When these places vanished, they took with them the threads of culture that bound communities to their past. Myths may have been born from this grief, stories of floods that covered the world, tales of gods punishing or cleansing humanity. In truth, these myths were not mere stories, but the echoes of lived trauma, carried forward so no one would forget what the sea was capable of. And still, humanity endured. The survivors became wanderers once more, adapting to landscapes that were often less generous than the ones they had lost. Forests were dense, mountains unforgiving, uplands less fertile than drowned river plains. To live here required more labor, more cooperation, more resilience. Children grew up with no memory of the vast plains their parents had described. For them, the world was already smaller, already fractured, already more difficult, and yet they learned to thrive in it, shaping new ways of life from the fragments of the old. The losses also shaped the very nature of culture. With every displacement came new stories, new adaptations. knowledge that had once been tied to specific landscapes, which riverbend was best for fishing, which meadow for grazing, had to be reinterpreted, relearned, passed down in a form that could survive without a fixed place. Oral traditions shifted. Songs no longer tied to particular valleys became songs of movement, of migration, of remembering what was lost and hoping for what might be found. The flood did not just destroy, it rewrote memory, reshaping humanity's relationship with the land into one of impermanence. Imagine gathering around a fire on high ground, the wind carrying the scent of pine, the stars wheeling above, and listening as elders told of lands that now lay under the sea. To the children it would have sounded almost like legend, a tale of another world, but to the adults it was memory, a wound still fresh. These stories became warnings, not to trust the ocean, not to linger in lowlands, to always be ready to move again. Perhaps it was here that humanity learned its greatest lesson of resilience, that nothing lasts, and that survival lies in the ability to adapt to change. And yet, even with resilience, the scars remained. Archaeological records show sudden absences, gaps that are not explained by gradual change but by abrupt abandonment. Villages vanish from the record, styles of tools and disappear without replacement. It is as if entire cultures were erased, leaving no trace but silence. This silence is the echo of the flood, the erasure not only of land, but of ways of being, of voices that no longer had ground to stand upon. To think of these human losses is to think of lives not as numbers or statistics, but as moments, the smell of smoke rising from a hearth doused by waves, the taste of salt in the air where once there was only the sweetness of meadow grass, the texture of damp earth where fields once lay dry, the sight of a horizon shifting, the sea climbing higher, the sky reflected in waters where once children ran barefoot. Each loss was not abstract but embodied, lived, carried in memory, and then often forgotten when those memories themselves were submerged. The flood was not the end of humanity, but it came close enough to brush against the edge of extinction. Civilizations that might have flowered earlier were drowned. Innovations that might have spread were cut short. What we know as the great arc of human progress could have begun centuries, even millennia earlier, had the seas not risen and erased so much. The story of humanity is not just one of advancement, but of survival in the face of overwhelming loss. And 12,000 years ago, that survival was far from certain. The waters rose and the people retreated. Populations dwindled, knowledge fragmented, cultures vanished. But in that retreat, in that narrowing, humanity carried forward a lesson written in water, that survival requires change, that memory must be carried even when land cannot, and that endurance is not only about holding on, but about letting go. The human losses of the great flood were profound. They shaped not only the history of our species, but its soul. We became a people of memory, of myth, of resilience born from grief. Civilization nearly ended before it began, but from the fragments humanity endured, carrying the echo of drowned coasts, vanished homelands, and forgotten villages into every step of the journey forward. As the waters advanced and the coasts dissolved into salt and tide, another shadow spread across the earth, quieter but just as final. The animals that had defined the Ice Age, the great companions and adversaries of early humanity, began to vanish. It was not a single death, not a sudden silence, but a long unraveling, like the dimming of stars at dawn. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats, creatures that had once shaped the rhythm of daily life, grew fewer, thinner, until their trails no longer marked the plains, and their voices no longer carried across the night air. Imagine the world then, alive with giants. The earth trembled beneath the weight of mammoth herds, their tusks gleaming in the pale light, sweeping arcs of ivory as long as a man was tall. Their breath steamed in the frosted morning, clouds rising from their mouths as they huddled together against the winds of the tundra. For thousands of years, humanity had followed them, hunters creeping close in silence, families waiting for the meat, the hides, the bones that could be turned into tools, shelters, fire. A single mammoth could sustain a band for weeks. Its fat kept fires burning. Its bones became frames for dwellings. Its hide wrapped families against the cold. To lose such a creature was not simply to lose an animal, but to lose an entire way of life. And yet the herds began to thin. The grasslands they had depended on shrank as forests advanced into newly thawed lands. Rising seas cut off migration routes. Valleys that once rang with the rumble of their movement filled with water. Some bands of mammoths survived longer in isolated regions, on windswept islands or in pockets of tundra, but their vast thundering presence, the heartbeat of the Ice Age, began to fade. For the hunters who once relied on their tracks, it must have felt like chasing ghosts, following trails that grew faint until they disappeared entirely. The mastodons too receded into memory. These forest-dwelling cousins of the mammoth browsed among trees, stripping branches, cracking twigs beneath their heavy steps. Imagine the sound of the chewing in quiet woodlands, the scent of broken saplings where they passed. They were creatures of shelter and shadow, essential to those who hunted them in the dense forests of the Americas. But as climates shifted, as their habitats drowned beneath floods or dried into grassless ground, they dwindled. Archaeological remains show their bones scattered in places where humans had feasted, their tusks carved into tools and ornaments. Yet even as hunters took them, the greater force was the earth itself, reshaping the forests they depended upon, leaving them fewer places to thrive. Giant sloths moved with an ungainly grace across the Americas, their claws tearing at vegetation, their fur heavy with the scent of leaves and dust. They stood as tall as a house when they reared back, towering over the hunters who stalked them. To see one was to witness a living monument of the Ice Age, slow but immense, a reminder of how life had adapted in ways now unimaginable. And yet they too vanished. Their forests grew wetter, saltier, or colder than they could endure. Their trails faded, their bones became scattered relics in caves and riverbeds, reminders of a time when giants walked where now only silence remains. And what of the saber-toothed cats, with their fangs like daggers curving from their jaws? Imagine their silhouettes at dusk, stalking herds on open plains, their low growls vibrating in the chest of anyone who heard them. For thousands of years they had been both predators and rivals to humans, competing for the same prey, feared in the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Their disappearance was both a relief and a loss, a predator gone, but also a thread pulled from the fabric of a world where danger and wonder had always walked hand in hand. Scientists still debate the exact cause of this great extinction. Was it the chaos of climate, the floods that drowned valleys, the forests that crept into grasslands, the ecosystems reshaped so quickly that even the giants could not adapt? Or was it the growing skill of human hunters, who had learned to craft sharper spears, to work together in greater numbers, to drive animals into traps and ambushes from which there was no escape? Perhaps it was both, intertwined. Beasts already stressed by vanishing habitats, pushed past the brink by the precision of human hands. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. One by one, the great animals disappeared. For humans, the loss was devastating. To lose the mammoth was to lose not only a food source, but fire, shelter, clothing, tools. A single hunt could no longer sustain a family for weeks. Smaller prey, deer, boar, rabbits, were plentiful, but they required more labor, more hunting, more energy expended for less reward. The balance of life grew harder, the margin for survival thinner. Fires burned shorter, clothing grew patchier, shelters less sturdy. In many places, survival meant adapting not to a new abundance, but to a new scarcity. The double blow was almost unbearable. Not only were homelands being swallowed by the sea, but the great beasts that had sustained humanity for millennia were gone. Imagine standing on a cliff, looking down at a valley where mammoths once moved like rivers of fur and ivory, now filled with water, silent and still. Imagine the absence, the silence where once there had been thunder, the emptiness of a world without giants. The earth had grown smaller, quieter, emptier. The emptiness was not only physical, but cultural. Myths had grown around these creatures, stories told around firelight of mammoths as spirits of the cold, of cats as guardians of the night, of sloths as gentle giants who carried the wisdom of forests. To lose them was to lose not only sustenance, but the beings that filled imagination. Children no longer grew up seeing tusks crest the horizon, or hearing the bellow of giant beasts across the plain. A sense of wonder itself may have been dimmed, the world seeming less enchanted without its colossal inhabitants, and yet, even in loss, humanity adapted. The absence of giants forced innovation. Spears grew more refined. Fishing became more important. Seeds and roots, once supplementary, became vital. Cooperation deepened because small prey could not sustain unless shared and stored. Families leaned into memory, into story, into culture to fill the gaps left by the vanished beasts. What was lost was immense, but what remained was the resilience to endure. Still, the transformation was irreversible. The world that emerged after the flood and extinction was not the same as the one that had existed before. It was quieter, more fragile, more human in scale. The vast animals that had once dwarfed us were gone, and in their absence humanity stood more alone. Civilization, when it came, would not be built beside herds of mammoths or beneath the shadows of saber-toothed cats. It would rise in a world emptied of giants, a world where the greatest force left was not the beasts of the plains, but the people who had survived their passing. This was the inheritance of the flood, not only drowned coasts and vanished homelands, but the silence of a world stripped of its giants. The new earth was smaller, leaner, emptier. Humanity had endured, but the cost was written in absence. What was once a partnership, fragile, dangerous, but shared, between people and beasts was gone, and the question lingered in the quiet plains and empty forests: was this survival, or was it a kind of loss that could never be undone? Though the waters receded long ago, their passage left scars too vast to ignore. The earth itself remembers. In valleys, in stone, in layers of silt and sand, the memory of the great flood lingers like a whisper written into the bones of the planet. Each mark tells a story, of rivers that swelled until they carved canyons out of granite, of boulders carried like pebbles for miles, of entire coastlines drowned beneath salt. If you walk the land carefully, if you know where to look, you can still see the traces. In North America, the ground bears the handwriting of catastrophe. Imagine standing in eastern Washington, where the Missoula floods carved landscapes unlike any other on earth. Deep channels cut into basalt stretch across the plains like claw marks, left by some enormous hand. Water once thundered through here, a wall hundreds of feet high, moving faster than any living thing could run. It scoured the ground bare, leaving behind vast ripple marks the size of hills, frozen waves in stone that still undulate across the land. Picture running your hands over those ridges, the texture of stone shaped into the rhythm of water, a river's motion captured and held for eternity. The air here carries a strange silence, as if even the wind remembers the roar of floods too great to imagine. Scattered across these floodplains are boulders far too large to belong where they rest. Some weigh as much as houses, others as great as ships, and yet they lie stranded in valleys of fine silt. These erratics were carried by ice, locked within glaciers that broke apart, swept for hundreds of miles, and set down gently when the waters slowed. Imagine the sound of them tumbling, scraping against rock, shuddering into place, only to sit for millennia as silent witnesses to the chaos that moved them. A person walking today may mistake them for ordinary stones, but they are travelers, dislocated giants, resting where the flood commanded them to stop. Beneath the seas, the evidence is even clearer. Sonar scans of the ocean floor reveal drowned river deltas, their branching veins still visible in the darkness. Imagine rivers that once cut through green valleys, their waters shallow and sweet, now preserved in outline beneath miles of salt water. From above, they appear like ghosts, etched into the seabed, reminders that coasts we think eternal are only temporary. Around the British Isles, the drowned outlines of Doggerland's rivers remain visible, pathways of a world that existed for thousands of years and then was erased in a heartbeat. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the trickle of those ancient streams, the laughter of children splashing along their banks, all now silenced beneath the North Sea. The Black Sea holds another story, written in layers of mud and sand. Sediment cores taken from its floor show a sharp line. Above, saltwater deposits rich with marine shells. Below, freshwater layers filled with the remnants of river life. This line marks a moment of sudden transformation, when Mediterranean waters surged through the Bosporus and turned a vast freshwater lake into the sea we know today. Imagine living along its shores, tending crops in fertile soil, only to watch brackish water creep higher each year, then faster, until the lake became ocean. For the people who lived there, this was no gradual change but a catastrophe, the land itself turning alien, the water no longer safe to drink, the rivers poisoned by salt. Even in deserts, far from today's oceans, traces remain. Fossilized shorelines ring ancient basins, ridges of gravel and sand marking where water once stood. In places like the Sahara, where endless dunes stretch beneath a burning sun, there are scars of ancient rivers, wide and sinuous, carved when the land was green. Imagine walking there at dusk, the sand cool beneath your feet, and realizing that beneath the grains lies a memory of floods that coursed like veins across the land. The desert is not eternal. It too remembers water. Glacial valleys hold their own testimony. In Scandinavia, in Canada, in the highlands of Scotland, the land is gouged and grooved, scratched by ice that dragged stones across its surface like knives across soft clay. Lakes now filling those valleys are remnants of the Great Retreat. Their waters are often dark, deep, and still, carrying a silence that feels older than time. To dip your hand into them is to touch the melted remains of ice that once buried continents, to feel in the chill of the water the breath of an age when glaciers ruled the horizon. All across the world, from the Andes to the Himalayas, there are signs of sudden outbursts, vast fans of gravel where floods rushed from melting ice, ridges of moraine where glaciers paused before collapsing, stranded shorelines high above modern seas. These features seem impossible until you remember the scale of the waters that moved them, A wall of water hundreds of feet high does not flow like a river. It devours. It carries entire forests, scatters stones the size of temples, erases the very shape of the land. To walk through these regions now is to walk through a gallery of scars, each one whispering of chaos, each one reminding us that the earth beneath our feet is not stable but shifting, alive, impermanent. For ancient humans, these were not abstract geologic processes. They were lived realities. Imagine building a camp beside a river and waking to a sound like thunder that does not stop. The ground shakes, the air vibrates, and then the flood arrives, trees torn from the banks, boulders rolling in the current, animals screaming as they are swept away. Fires are drowned, voices silenced, the landscape transformed in a single night. Survivors climbed to higher ground, watching as their world was erased. For them the scars we see in stone today were not symbols, but memories, etched into their lives as deeply as they are etched into the earth. Science gives us the names: outburst floods, meltwater pulses, glacial retreat. But the human experience was something different. Terror, wonder, disbelief at the sheer power of water. To them the flood was a god, unstoppable and merciless, redrawing the world, with a hand that cared nothing for memory or belonging. And so they told stories. The myths of deluge that echo across cultures, of waters that rose to cover the world, of survivors carried on boats or clinging to mountains, are not fabrications, but interpretations of scars, attempts to explain the unexplainable. Even now, when we trace sonar across the ocean floor, or drill cores from the depths of ancient lakes, we are uncovering their memories. Each channel, each erratic boulder, each drowned valley is a page from the same story. The earth does not forget. Its stones are its memory, its waters, its voice. And when we listen, we hear the same tale told again and again, that the world was reshaped in a heartbeat, that survival was fragile, that nothing, not even mountains or plains, was beyond the reach of water. To stand before these scars today is to feel small, to feel time stretch beyond comprehension. The ripples in basalt that tower above you were made by waves of water so vast they defy imagination. The boulders stranded in green fields were carried on journeys longer than entire human migrations. The drowned deltas beneath the sea once fed villages whose smoke rose into the sky, now sealed beneath silence. Each trace is a reminder not just of what happened, but of how quickly it can happen again. And yet, there is also a strange beauty in these marks. The channels gleam in the sunlight, their ridges softened by moss. The erratics sit like monuments, draped in lichen, watching centuries pass. The drowned rivers appear as elegant veins in sonar scans, like the lifeblood of the earth still visible beneath the surface. Even catastrophe leaves behind patterns of grace, reminders that destruction and creation are bound together, that the same forces that erase also reveal. The evidence is there for anyone who looks, in stone, in water, in silence. A record of a catastrophe so immense it reshaped not only landscapes but humanity itself. For ancient people it was not theory, not debate, but daily life. For us it is memory written into the earth, a reminder that we live not above the planet but within it, and that its rhythms, however slow or sudden, will always shape us. Long after the waters had claimed the coasts and the giants had vanished from the plains, the memory of the flood lived on in words. It lingered in the rhythm of stories told around firelight, in chants whispered beside rivers, in carvings etched into stone. Humanity could not hold on to every detail of what had happened, the exact height of the waters, the precise course of rivers, the names of drowned valleys, but what they could hold, they did. the feeling of loss, the terror of rising seas, the awe of survival against impossible odds. And so the flood became myth, reshaped again and again until it echoed from one side of the world to the other, from Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to the Pacific. The stories align in uncanny ways. Always there is water. Always it rises higher than any before. Always it spares only a few. These are not just tales invented for entertainment. They are memories carried in the only vessel fragile enough and strong enough to endure across millennia. Story. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest written works in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh preserves a flood narrative that feels hauntingly familiar. A man named Utnapishtim is warned of a deluge sent to wipe out humanity. He builds a great vessel, seals it with pitch, and carries with him animals of every kind. When the waters recede, his boat comes to rest on a mountain top, and he releases birds to see if dry land has returned. The echoes of this story ripple outward, carried into the later tale of Noah in the Hebrew Bible, where again a chosen survivor builds an ark, gathers animals, and finds salvation atop a mountain. The details shift, the names change, but the core remains, a flood that covers the earth, and a fragile remnant that survives. In India, the tale of Manu speaks of a fish who warns a man of an oncoming flood. The fish, sometimes seen as the god Vishnu, tells Manu to build a boat. When the waters rise, the fish pulls the vessel to safety, guiding it to the high peaks of the Himalayas. Again, humanity is nearly erased. Again, survival comes by water. Again, a story preserves the terror of rising seas. The imagery is vivid, the feel of rain pounding against wood, the sight of waves swallowing forests, the strange comfort of being led by a divine protector through chaos into safety. Among indigenous peoples of the Americas, flood stories are abundant and diverse, yet always recognizable. The Hopi tell of a time when the earth was cleansed by a flood, and only those who listened to the instructions of Spider-Woman and sought refuge survived. In Mesoamerica, stories speak of successive worlds destroyed by floods before the current age of humanity was born. Farther north, among Algonquin traditions, a great flood once covered the land, and survival came when animals dove beneath the waters to retrieve soil, bringing up mud to create new earth. Each story carries the same essence: water rising to erase, survival snatched from the brink, a world remade. Across the Pacific, too, the pattern persists. In Hawaii, there are tales of Nu'u, who built an ark to survive a flood sent by gods. In Maori tradition, the ancestor Ruatapu unleashed a great flood to destroy his kin, sparing only those who escaped in canoes. Even in far-flung Australia, Aboriginal stories recall floods that reshaped coasts and drowned sacred lands. It is as though the trauma of rising seas was so vast, so unforgettable, that it impressed itself into every corner of the human imagination, carried across oceans, mountains, and deserts, unchanged in its essence, though dressed in different forms. The similarities are too striking to dismiss as coincidence. Scholars debate whether these stories are memories of local floods, river deluges, tsunamis, sudden storms, or whether they are echoes of the same global catastrophe, the great meltwater floods at the end of the Ice Age. Perhaps both are true. Local events refreshed the memory of the older trauma, ensuring that the archetype of the flood remained alive. Each new inundation reminded people of the first, the greatest flood, the one that had nearly erased humanity. Myths became layers of memory, woven together, repeated until they were inseparable from culture itself. To imagine these stories in their original form is to imagine them spoken not as distant parables, but as urgent reminders. Picture a group gathered around a fire, the night alive with the crackle of flames, the air thick with the smell of smoke and damp earth. An elder speaks softly, his voice measured, his words deliberate. He tells of the time when water covered the earth, when the sea rose higher than mountains, when only the quick or the chosen survived. Children listen wide-eyed, their small bodies pressed close to their mothers. The story is not entertainment, it is instruction, a way of saying, "Be ready, for the waters can return." Even today, the resonance of these myths remains. They are among the oldest stories we tell, older than empires, older than writing, older than memory written in stone, and they carry with them an emotional truth that science alone cannot convey. The geological record shows us layers of silt and stone, erratics stranded in valleys, drowned deltas beneath the sea, but the myths show us how it felt, the fear, the awe, the grief, the fragile hope of survival. They give voice to the silence of the drowned. There is something dreamlike in the way these stories cross cultures, as though humanity itself was whispering the same memory into 1,000 different tongues. Imagine voices rising across millennia, carrying the same refrain. The waters came, the world was almost lost, and yet we survived. That refrain is perhaps the oldest lullaby of our species, a song born not from comfort but from endurance. It cradled us through the night of disaster, reminding us not that we were safe, but that we had endured once and might endure again. The flood myths remind us that memory is not only written in stone and water, but in imagination. Myths are living fossils of experience, carrying fragments of truth through the fragile medium of story. And like fossils, they preserve not everything, but enough, the shape, the outline, the impression of what once was. When we listen to them, we are not hearing fiction, but echoes of the great flood itself, softened by the passage of time, but still resonant, still warning, still alive. Perhaps this is why they endure when so much else has been forgotten. Villages sank, tools rusted, languages vanished, but the story of the flood persisted, because it was too important to lose. It was not simply about the past. It was about survival, about resilience, about the fragility of the human place in a world far larger and more powerful than ourselves. To remember the flood was to remember humility. To pass it on was to protect the future. And so across continents and oceans, across cultures and centuries, the flood myths remain. They are not uniform, but they are united. They speak of a world reshaped by water, of humanity tested, of life beginning again from the brink of extinction. They remind us that we are a species born of catastrophe, tempered by survival, carrying with us always the memory of the waters that rose. When you listen to them closely, you can almost hear the waves in the background, the steady rhythm of the sea reminding us of what once was. The myths are not separate from the scars in stone, not apart from the evidence in sediment and sonar. They are another layer of memory, woven into words instead of rock, carried in hearts instead of valleys. Together they tell the same story. The flood was real, it was vast, and it changed humanity forever. Long after the first great meltwater floods had reshaped the continents, there was another catastrophe, smaller in scale perhaps, but just as devastating for those who lived through it. Around 7600 years ago, the calm waters of a vast freshwater lake, what we now call the Black Sea, were transformed in an instant. The Mediterranean, swollen by rising seas, broke through the narrow Bosporus Strait, and the flood that followed turned a fertile world into ocean. Imagine standing on those shores before the breach. The air would have been heavy with a sense of warm earth and growing fields. Villages dotted the wide plains, the smoke rising in thin ribbons at dawn, mingling with the mist above rivers that wound lazily towards the horizon. Children played along shallow banks, their feet sinking into mud rich with reeds and fish darting between their toes. Farmers bent low in the soil, their hands dark with clay, coaxing seeds into life in one of the first landscapes where humanity had begun to tether itself to the earth through farming. To these people, the Black Sea was not a sea at all, but a great lake, calm, abundant, and kind. And then, one day, the waters came. The Bosporus, a narrow channel between what is now Turkey and Europe, gave way under the pressure of the rising Mediterranean. Salt water surged forward with a violence no one could have prepared for. Imagine the sound of it, a roar that built and built, louder than thunder, the vibration of the earth itself shaking beneath the force. Walls of water rushed through the strait, a torrent that carved new channels into stone, carrying trees, soil, and everything in its path. The calm freshwater lake swelled, rising meter by meter, until entire valleys were gone. Villages that had stood for generations vanished beneath waves that did not retreat. For the people who lived there, it must have felt like the end of the world. The lake that had always been a source of food and life turned alien. Its water, once sweet and drinkable, became brackish with salt. Fish that had sustained families for generations floated lifeless as their ecosystems collapsed. Croplands, painstakingly tilled and nurtured, drowned beneath waves. Burial grounds, sacred places where ancestors had been honored, disappeared beneath the rising tide. Imagine standing helpless as the earth you had tended, the graves you had visited, the paths you had walked since childhood were swallowed, leaving only endless water where there had once been life. The speed of the flood was merciless. Some estimates suggest the waters may have risen at a rate of 6 inches a day. To modern ears, that may sound slow, but imagine watching the shoreline creep closer every morning, swallowing a little more of the fields, reaching a little farther into the village. Imagine waking to find that the fire pit you had sat around the night before now lay in shallow water, the ashes washed away. At that rate, entire houses would have been engulfed in weeks. Fields carefully planted in spring would not survive to harvest. Families who hesitated were trapped. Archaeological evidence hints at sudden abandonment in the region. Settlements left unfinished, tools and pottery buried quickly in silt. Beneath the waters of the modern Black Sea, sonar mapping reveals the outlines of river valleys, now drowned, their shapes still visible in the dark. Sediment cores tell the story in unmistakable detail. A sharp transition from freshwater to saltwater life, from a lake filled with river fish to a sea rich with shells. The shift is not gradual, but abrupt, a line as sharp as if drawn by a hand across time. It is perhaps no wonder that this flood became myth. Some researchers believe this event may lie behind the biblical story of Noah, or at least contribute to its imagery. The timing aligns. Cultures of the Near East would have carried the memory of a flood that erased villages, forcing migrations, leaving behind the sense of divine wrath or cosmic cleansing. In the story of Noah, waters rise to cover the earth, sparing only a chosen few, carried on a vessel filled with animals. The essence is the same: catastrophe, loss, survival against impossible odds. Whether or not the Black Sea deluge is the origin, its resonance with these stories is undeniable. But the Black Sea flood was not alone. It was part of a pattern, a reminder that floods were not a single event in the distant past, but a recurring nightmare. The great meltwater surges had redrawn continents. The Black Sea deluge came later, swallowing one of the first cradles of human farming. Again and again, humanity built on shifting ground, only to watch the ground dissolve. Each flood was unique, but the story was the same: abundance followed by erasure. Think of the human toll. Families displaced, forced to leave everything behind. Entire cultures scattered, their stories carried inland by survivors who never returned to their drowned homes. Perhaps these refugees brought with them the seeds of agriculture, the knowledge of irrigation, the stories of a flood that had taken everything. In this way, disaster also became a vector of growth, spreading ideas, mixing traditions, igniting innovation in new lands. But for those who lived through it, it was only loss. The sensory memory must have been seared into them. The smell of salt creeping into fresh water streams, the sight of waves lapping at doorways, climbing higher every day, the texture of soil turning to mud, then to silt, then vanishing altogether beneath water, the sound of animals panicking as pastures shrank, the taste of brackish water on the tongue, bitter and strange where once it had been sweet. For the survivors, these memories would never fade. They would become stories, carried into the future, retold until they became myths of gods and punishments, of cleansings and renewals. When we look at the Black Sea today, its surface calm and endless, it is easy to forget the violence that filled it. But beneath its waters lie the ruins of plains, forests, and villages that once flourished. The sea is a graveyard of memory, holding in silence the echoes of voices, the imprints of lives erased by flood. To sail across it is to glide above a lost world, to drift above stories that can no longer be spoken except in myth. And so, the Black Sea deluge stands as a reminder that humanity has never been separate from the rhythms of the planet. We have always lived at the mercy of water, of climate, of change. The flood was not punishment, not a judgment, but the natural consequence of a world in motion. And yet, for those who endured it, it felt personal, intimate, as though the earth itself had turned against them. That feeling, more than the facts, is what survived, preserved in stories, carried in myths, whispered across generations. The flood was not a single story, but a chorus. First the meltwater pulses, then the drowned coasts, then the Black Sea, and others besides. Each time the waters rose. Each time humanity clung to survival. Each time the memory was carved into myth, ensuring that the story of the flood would outlive the flood itself. And though the Black Sea was only one of many, its voice still echoes, deep and resonant, in the waters that lie silent beneath the sun. When the waters refused to retreat, when valleys became inlets and familiar paths dissolved into salt, humanity did what it had always done. It adapted. To remain in place was to drown, to cling to the past was to starve, and so, in the face of a world transformed, our ancestors began to reshape their ways of living, turning disaster into instruction, grief into resilience. The flood was a merciless teacher, but it was also a profound one. Imagine a family climbing a ridge above their drowned homeland. The air is thinner here, the wind sharper, carrying with it the scent of pine instead of the damp sweetness of reed and marsh. Below, where once there had been fields and fishing spots, the water glimmers in the light of dawn, an endless mirror where land used to stretch. The ground underfoot is rocky, less generous, but it is solid. Here fires can be built without fear of the tide creeping closer at night. Here the ocean cannot take what little remains. And so settlements rose on hills and cliffs, human voices carried higher, their smoke twisting into skies that had never known it before. But high ground alone could not feed them. With coasts and plains swallowed, People turned inland, learning to lean on rivers and lakes for sustenance. Imagine the still surface of a mountain lake, its waters dark and cold, reflecting the peaks around it. Beneath that surface darted fish that had once been overlooked, now caught with hooks carved from bone, nets woven from reeds carried inland. Rivers became highways of life, their currents guiding migrations, their banks offering fertile soil for the first experiments in cultivation. What the sea had taken, rivers and lakes gave back in quieter abundance. Innovation became not just helpful, but essential. Old methods of hunting no longer sufficed when herds scattered, when giants like mammoths and mastodons dwindled into extinction. Hunters learned to stalk smaller prey with greater skill. The sound of arrows slicing through air replaced the thunder of spears crashing against massive hides. Snares and traps multiplied, quiet tools that could catch rabbits and birds, filling the gaps left by vanished beasts. The texture of survival shifted from the heavy leathery hide of mammoth tents to the softer pelts of deer from towering bones framing shelters to lattices of wood and woven reeds. What had once seemed lesser became indispensable. Storage, too, became a matter of survival. When floods disrupted the steady rhythm of seasons, people learned to keep food longer than before. Seeds were dried and hidden in woven baskets sealed with clay. Meat was smoked until its flavor deepened, carrying the scent of wood into long winters. Roots were buried in pits to stay cool, safe from rot. Imagine the earthy smell of a storage pit opening, the relief of finding food when the forests outside offered little, the gratitude of knowing that foresight could mean life. Out of desperation, the idea of planning for the future grew sharper, more deliberate, and with scarcity came cooperation. One family could not endure alone. Clans merged, villages grew denser, voices more numerous around shared fires. Imagine the murmur of a crowded shelter on a stormy night, the soft rustle of hides, the crackle of firewood as hands passed food from one to another. Disputes must have flared, tempers sharpened by hunger, but the need for unity was stronger. To survive the flood meant to share knowledge, to divide labor, to protect one another. Out of necessity grew bonds that would one day form the scaffolding of societies. Trade, too, adapted to the new world. Old routes that had followed coasts were gone, swallowed beneath the sea. But people found new ways. Paths climbed over mountain passes, canoes skimmed the surfaces of rivers, trails wound through valleys, newly revealed by retreating ice. Imagine the sound of feet crunching on gravel paths, of paddles cutting silently through dark water, of voices greeting strangers in lands once unfamiliar. Shells from the sea still turned up far inland, obsidian blades found their way across continents, amber traveled from forests to plains. Even in the midst of disaster, humanity reached outward, weaving threads of connection to replace those torn apart by water. And within these adaptations lay the seeds of something larger. Perhaps it was here, in the crucible of necessity, that the first sparks of complex society flickered. The flood forced concentration, people gathering in smaller, safer areas, their lives more intertwined than ever before. Tasks became specialized, some hunting, others fishing, some storing food, others tending the first fragile crops. Leadership may have emerged, not as domination but as guidance, voices that carried memory, that could organize survival. Rituals too likely deepened as people sought meaning in the chaos, offering prayers or sacrifices to rivers, lakes, and skies, hoping to hold back the waters that had already taken so much. The sensory world of this adaptation was different from the one that came before. No longer the vast openness of plains filled with mammoths, but smaller, denser landscapes of forest and ridge, The air was damp with moss, the soundscape filled with birdsong instead of thundering herds. Fires smoked in sheltered coves, their scent mixing with pine and wet stone. The texture of life had shifted, narrower, harder, but no less alive. It was in these spaces, pressed tight against nature's unpredictability, that resilience hardened into a permanent part of humanity's identity. For children born after the flood, this new life was not adaptation but normalcy. They grew up knowing only the safety of high ground, the taste of smoked meat, the rhythm of rivers carrying fish in endless silver shoals. They heard stories of the great plains now lost beneath seas, but to them those stories were as distant as dreams. Their world was smaller, but it was also more secure, shaped by the lessons their parents had paid for with grief. These children would carry forward not just memory, but practice, the habit of storing food, the instinct to build away from water's edge, the need to cooperate. They were, perhaps unknowingly, the first citizens of a more structured human world. Even art adapted. Caves and shelters filled with new kinds of markings, symbols that may have recorded not only animals and hunts, but cycles of seasons, floods, and stars. Imagine running your fingers along the rough wall of such a cave, tracing lines that once held meaning for a people desperate to predict the next disaster, to find stability in patterns written above and around them. Storytelling became more than entertainment. It was a survival tool, carrying warnings from one generation to the next, encoding memory in ways that stone tools could not. The flood had stripped humanity of comfort, but it had also revealed humanity's greatest strength: transformation. Out of scarcity came innovation. Out of displacement came connection. Out of loss came resilience. The strategies that emerged in those centuries would not only preserve life but sow the first seeds of civilization. And always the sensory memory lingered, the sound of rivers swelling with fish, the sight of smoke rising from clustered shelters, the texture of clay-sealed baskets holding precious seeds, the taste of brackish water giving way to the sweetness of mountain springs, the feel of stone tools shaped sharper, finer, more precise than before. Survival was no longer only endurance, it was adaptation, made tangible, lived in every sight, sound, and breath. The flood had been brutal, merciless, erasing worlds entire, but what it left behind was a species tempered by necessity, a people who had learned that survival was not about resisting change but embracing it. In every new settlement on high ground, in every basket of stored grain, in every story told to warn children, the strategies of survival became the architecture of a future that, in time, would blossom into civilization itself. When the waters finally steadied, when the wild rushing of melt and flood gave way to calmer rivers and seas, humanity found itself gathered in places where survival was possible. What had begun as refuge slowly became permanence. The very rivers that had once threatened to drown the earth became lifelines, drawing people to their banks, teaching them that water could be more than a destroyer. It could be the foundation of a new way of life. Out of loss, out of fear, out of the memory of flood, civilization was born. Imagine the banks of the Nile in the quiet of early morning. The river runs smooth and silver under the first touch of sunlight, its surface broken only by the call of water birds and the lazy drift of reeds. Families emerge from shelters of mud brick, their feet pressing into damp soil, still soft from the night's dew. The air carries the cool sweetness of water and the earthy promise of fertile land. Here, unlike the drowned coasts, the water does not rise unpredictably. It floods with rhythm, with the pulse of the seasons, leaving behind dark silt rich with life. What once terrified now nourishes, and people learn to see the flood not as a curse but as a gift. The Tigris and Euphrates offered a different world, a harsher one. Their floods came swiftly, sometimes destructively, carving new channels overnight, leaving entire villages scrambling to adapt. Yet between them lay soil as fertile as any on earth. Imagine walking through fields of young grain, swaying in the hot breeze, the stalks whispering against each other like soft voices. The rivers glitter in the distance, their currents quick, carrying driftwood and fish alike. People learned to tame these waters, not with force but with channels and ditches, bending them gently into patterns of irrigation. Mud walls rose, guiding streams into crops, storing excess in ponds and basins. From this simple redirection of water came abundance, harvests larger than one family could eat, surpluses that could feed many. With surpluses came settlement. No longer did every group need to wander in search of food. Villages rooted themselves into the earth, huts replaced by sturdy homes of stone and clay, clustered tightly against one another. Fires smoked in permanent hearths, their soot blackening ceilings across generations. Imagine the smell of bread baking in clay ovens, of grain ground into flour, with the steady rhythm of stone against stone. The texture of life shifted once more, from the rough hide shelters of nomads to the smooth plastered walls of permanent dwellings, cool against the skin even in the heat of day. And with permanence came change in how people thought. Time was no longer measured only by the rising and setting of the sun, by the migrations of herds, or the ripening of wild berries. Time became agricultural, tethered to the cycles of planting and harvest, flood and drought. Stars were watched more carefully, their patterns traced to predict the return of seasons. Imagine lying on your back in a dark valley, the cool earth beneath you, the night alive with countless points of light. Above, constellations form, not yet stories of gods and heroes, but guides for survival. The flood had forced humanity to notice, to track, to plan, and in doing so it birthed astronomy, calendars, the first attempts to measure the dance of the heavens. The trauma of the flood lingered too. It echoed in myths of gods who controlled the waters, of offerings made to keep rivers kind, of rituals performed to honor ancestors lost to the sea. Temples rose along riverbanks, their altars filled with gifts of grain, fruit, and fish, tokens meant to placate powers greater than human strength. Imagine the sound of drums echoing through warm night air, the sight of torches flickering against stone walls, the taste of honey and dates offered in sacrifice. Rituals were not separate from survival. They were its shadow, the spiritual counterpart to irrigation and farming, ensuring that memory of catastrophe was never forgotten, that gratitude for stability was woven into daily life. As villages grew, so did complexity. Surpluses needed storing, fields needed organizing, canals needed repairing. Leadership emerged, not the wandering guides of nomadic bands, but settled figures who coordinated labor, who resolved the disputes, who perhaps first tasted the intoxicating power of command. Imagine a gathering at dusk, the glow of fire casting long shadows as a leader speaks, his words slow and steady, reminding the people to repair the dikes, to store grain, to prepare for the flood. His authority is practical, but over time it grows sacred. Those who could guide survival became more than leaders. They became figures of reverence. Crafts blossomed as well. Freed from the endless search for food, some turned to shaping clay into vessels, not just for storage, but for beauty. Pots etched with patterns of river and reed, vessels polished until they gleamed in the sun, carried water from streams to homes. Others turned to weaving, their fingers quick and sure, creating fabrics that softened life, that brought color into shelters of clay. Imagine the feel of woven cloth against your skin after a lifetime of hides and furs, the way it moved with wind, the way it carried dye, the color of berries and earth. Beauty, once a luxury, became part of life itself. Trade expanded once more, this time not only in shells and stone, but in grain, pottery, textiles. Villages exchanged surpluses, and with exchange came stories, ideas, new techniques. Imagine markets along the riverbanks, the air buzzing with voices, the smell of spices mingling with the sharp tang of fish drying in the sun, the sight of pottery lined in rows, gleaming with patterns unique to each maker. Rivers carried not just water, but culture, flowing across lands to knit human groups into larger webs of connection. And always, the rivers themselves remained at the center. They were not simply resources, they were lifelines, deities, the very axis around which human life now spun. The Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, they became more than geography. They became identity, the heart of the first civilizations. Their rhythms shaped law, art, belief, and memory. They were both destroyer and creator, mirrors of the great flood now tamed into smaller, predictable cycles. The sensory landscape of these river valleys was rich and new, the air heavy with the scent of wet soil after the flood, the hum of insects in fields, the texture of mud beneath bare feet as dikes were repaired, the taste of bread warm from clay ovens, the sight of harvests golden in the sun. This was not the life of wandering, nor the life of desperate survival in caves. It was something different, something rooted, deliberate, and full of possibility. Civilization, in its earliest form, did not arise from luxury or leisure. It arose from necessity. The flood had stripped humanity down to its most fragile state, and in rebuilding, people discovered new strengths. The rivers taught them permanence, the soil taught them patience, the cycles of water taught them reverence. Out of fear came faith, out of scarcity came abundance, out of survival came society. Every sunrise now lit more than a horizon. It lit a world where families awoke in homes that would stand for generations, where fields stretched green and gold across the land, where rivers shimmered with promise instead of threat. It was not yet the civilization we know, no towering ziggurats, no grand empires, no sprawling cities, but the foundations were there. The flood had been devastation, yes, but it had also been catalyst. Without it, perhaps humanity would have wandered longer, clinging to fragility. With it, we were pushed into permanence. The waters that nearly erased us became paradoxically the waters that sustained us. From Nile to Euphrates, from Indus to Yellow River, the pattern repeated. People gathered, people farmed, people built. Civilization was not born in defiance of water, but in partnership with it, and so the flood, in all its destruction, gave humanity its most enduring gift, the chance to turn survival into something greater, the chance to begin the long journey from fragile bands to flourishing societies. The memory of the flood is not held only in myth, or carved into stone, or hidden beneath the seas. It is written inside us. Each of us carries within our cells a record of survival, a faint but unbroken thread that stretches back to those who lived through the deluge. Modern DNA is not only a map of ancestry, it is a storybook, its pages filled with the whispers of crises endured, of populations reduced to fragments, of fragile beginnings, from which the vastness of humanity grew again. When the Ice Age ended, when the waters rose and the coasts dissolved, humanity shrank. The world did not hold the billions of people we know today. It held small bands, fragile, scattered, vulnerable to chance. Rising seas pushed groups inland, isolating them from one another, turning once connected plains into islands and once shared hunting grounds into impassable barriers. Genetic evidence shows this narrowing, what scientists call a bottleneck, a sudden reduction in diversity, a sign that only a few survived, and from them the many of us now alive descended. Imagine a family standing at the edge of a drowned valley, forced to leave behind everything familiar. They climb higher, their feet blistered from rocky slopes, their food dwindling. They are one of a dozen families who will survive here, pressed together by necessity, carrying their tools, their children, their hopes. For them survival is day by day, fire by fire, meal by meal. They cannot know that their bloodlines will stretch forward through thousands of years, reaching into the veins of people yet unborn. But their endurance, fragile as it seemed, was enough. They carried the spark through darkness. When scientists look into our DNA today, they find evidence of those fragile sparks, patterns of similarity, markers of shared ancestry, tell us that every non-African human alive descends from a few small migrant bands who braved the end of the Ice Age. Their genes spread outward, repopulating lands emptied by flood and famine. Each of us is, in a sense, a continuation of their survival, a living echo of the resilience they carried. But DNA tells more than just ancestry. It carries the signs of stress, of populations pushed to the edge. Certain sequences reveal bottlenecks, moments when the human family tree thinned until only a few branches remained. These are scars in our biology, just as valleys and drowned deltas are scars in the earth. They remind us that survival was not inevitable. It was chance, resilience, and timing, all bound together. The sensory details of this survival are hard to imagine, but no less real. Picture the thin air of highlands where refugees gathered, the sharp scent of pine carried on cold wind. Picture the taste of roots dug from stubborn soil, bitter but sustaining. Picture the sound of children crying from hunger, hushed by mothers who had no food left to give. The texture of survival was raw and unrelenting, and yet through it all, DNA was carried forward, tucked inside cells, passed from parent to child, generation after generation. Sometimes it was geography itself that decided survival. Rising seas, split populations, stranding some on islands, scattering others into mountain valleys. Those who remained were small in number, but isolation preserved them. Over time, their genes became the foundation of future populations, spreading outward once the waters calmed. Imagine standing on a high ridge, looking down at a drowned plain, realizing that those below are cut off forever. The sense of aloneness must have been profound. And yet that aloneness ensured survival, because small groups, though vulnerable, were also adaptable, capable of moving into new niches and making them home. The genetic record also tells us of resilience hidden in silence. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to children, carries a lineage that stretches back, unbroken, to a single woman, often called mitochondrial Eve. She was not the only woman alive in her time, but her line alone survived, passed through the chaos of climate and flood, reaching into every person alive today. Imagine her, an ordinary woman tending a fire, holding her child against her chest. She could not have known she would be remembered in every cell of her descendants, that her survival through floods and scarcity would ripple through tens of thousands of years. Her presence, ordinary and fragile, became eternal through the endurance of her line. There is awe in realizing how close humanity came to vanishing. Genetic bottlenecks suggest our numbers dwindled to only a few thousand at times, a heartbeat away from extinction. One storm too many, one failed migration, one disease outbreak could have ended the story, and yet it did not. Against impossible odds, the thread of life held. The warmth of fires kept burning. The rhythm of footsteps kept moving forward. And so the story continued, woven into flesh, carried in blood. Today, when we share stories of the flood, when we stand before oceans or gaze at rivers, we do so not only as listeners of myth, but as living proof of survival. Our DNA is a chorus of endurance, each of us a harmony and a song that began tens of thousands of years ago. The flood did not erase us. It pressed us into a smaller shape, but from that narrowness, resilience expanded. Imagine holding your hand up to the light, seeing the faint lines of veins beneath the skin. Within those veins flows not just blood but history. The survival of families who climbed ridges, who fled advancing waves, who carried seeds in baskets and fire in stone bowls. The warmth you feel is not only life in the present, but the echo of countless pasts, of generations who refused to let the thread break. The story of survival is not only one of strength, it is also one of chance. Many perished, entire groups vanished, their lineages ending in silence, their stories lost except perhaps in the faint echoes of myth. Others endured, not because they were stronger, but because they were luckier in where they settled, in what they carried, in the storms they did or did not face. Our DNA reminds us of this fragility, that we are here not because survival was certain, but because chance aligned with resilience at the right moment, and yet fragility itself became strength. Knowing loss, humanity became more adaptable. Knowing hunger, we learned to store food. Knowing displacement, we learned to travel farther. Each adaptation left traces not only in culture, but in biology, in the genes that allowed us to digest new foods, to endure new climates, to thrive in places once inhospitable. The flood forced us into transformation, and that transformation became encoded in who we are. Close your eyes and imagine the earth 12,000 years ago. Seas still rising, glaciers collapsing, rivers bursting their banks. Amid that chaos, small bands huddle together, their fires flickering against the night. They are cold, hungry, frightened, and yet they survive. From them comes us. Every language spoken today, every song sung, every story told is a continuation of their survival. The flood left scars on the land, yes, but it also left scars within us. Scars that remind us not of defeat, but of endurance. In every cell, in every breath, the story of survival continues. The flood nearly ended us. Instead, it shaped us. And through DNA, through the whispers of our ancestors, hidden in strands of code, it still speaks. Beneath the quiet skin of the oceans lies another earth, a hidden one, a world drowned long before our time. It is a place of rivers that no longer flow, of valleys that no longer echo with footsteps, of forests that no longer sway in the wind. What we call seabed today was once open land, stretching in plains and meadows beneath skies that had never tasted salt. Now those lands sleep under hundreds of feet of water, their stories muted by waves, their shapes preserved in silence. Close your eyes and imagine walking across what is now the floor of the North Sea, before the waters rose. You would find yourself on Doggerland, a vast green plain that once connected Britain to Europe. The air would be alive with the cries of birds, with the low thunder of herds moving across grass. Small streams trickled through marshland, their surfaces broken by reeds where fish darted in silver flashes. Families built shelters near those streams, fires glowing in the dusk, their smoke carried away by winds rolling unbroken across the plain. Now to stand above that same space is to see only endless water, grey and restless, hiding everything beneath its surface, and Doggerland is only one of many. Across the globe, sonar reveals ancient coastlines, etched into the seabed like forgotten signatures. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf once joined islands into a single supercontinent. Imagine walking from what is now Thailand across dry land all the way to Borneo, passing through forests thick with elephants and tigers, listening to the air alive with the hum of insects, the sharp call of birds in the canopy. People lived there, hunted there, shared stories beneath starlit skies that stretched across one continuous land. When the waters rose, those stories were scattered, their lands broken into the countless islands we know today. Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia. Where there was once unity, there is now fragmentation, each island carrying its own echo of the drowned whole. Around India lies another mystery, the drowned shelf that hugs its coasts. Off the shores of Gujarat, sonar has traced the outlines of what some believe may have been ancient settlements, swallowed thousands of years ago when seas surged inland. Imagine the sound of waves crashing against those vanished walls, the stones smoothed by tides that once knew no salt. Could the world's first villages, its earliest attempts at permanence, lie hidden there? If so, their story is not only forgotten, but sealed beneath an ocean that both conceals and preserves. The Mediterranean, too, hides its ghosts. Long before it became a sea as we know it, it was a basin that filled and emptied with the earth's shifting rhythms. Today its seabed bears the scars of ancient rivers, now drowned, their outlines still visible as though sketched by a careful hand. Off the coasts of Greece and Italy, divers sometimes find traces of walls and pavements, stone cut by human hands and then claimed by the sea. Imagine the feel of those stones under your fingers, rough and worn, each groove a silent testament to a life lived before the waters rose. These are not the grand ruins of later civilizations, but the humble beginnings, hearths, pathways, foundations. Yet they may hold the answers to questions we have barely begun to ask. Each of these submerged worlds is more than geology. They are the missing chapters of our story. For every site we can dig in the earth, there are countless more that lie hidden beneath the oceans, erased not by time alone, but by water. Archaeologists say that perhaps 2/3 of early human settlements now lie underwater. Imagine the weight of that. Entire histories gone from sight. How many languages disappeared beneath those waves? How many songs were sung for the last time on shores that are now seabed? How many inventions, rituals, and first sparks of civilization lie sealed in salt, never to be uncovered? And yet the ocean does not erase entirely, it preserves. Beneath layers of silt and sand, stone hearths still wait. Tools of flint, beads of shell, even fragments of bone may lie untouched, shielded from decay by the deep. Sonar shows us the ghostly shapes of river valleys, delta fans, even the outlines of what could have been dwellings. Each discovery is a glimpse into a world erased, a reminder that what we know of our past is only the fragment left above water. The sensory imagining of this is haunting. Picture diving down through cold green waters, the sunlight fading into dimness. Your breath is loud in your ears, bubbles rising past your face, and then, as the silt clears, you see it. The straight line of a wall, too regular to be natural. You run your fingers along it, the texture rough but unmistakably human. Around you, fish drift through what was once a village, their scales flashing in the dim light. Where once there were fires and laughter, there is now only silence and water. The drowned world lives on, not in voices, but in whispers of stone. Some have wondered if myths of lost lands, Atlantis, Lemuria, Kumari Kandam, are echoes of these sunken worlds. Perhaps they are not fantasy, but memory magnified, the human imagination straining to preserve the truth of lands that vanished beneath the waves. People would not easily forget the moment their homes, their sacred places, their very histories disappeared. They would carry that memory into story, shaping it until it grew into legend. And while legend stretches truth, it often begins in reality. Atlantis may not have been a city of marble towers, but Doggerland was real, Sunda was real, the Black Sea flood was real. Myths may be the shadows of truths drowned long ago. Science, too, is only beginning to listen to these drowned stories. Sonar mapping, deep-sea exploration, underwater archaeology, all reveal glimpses, but only glimpses. The oceans are vast, their depths difficult to search. Each discovery raises more questions. Were there villages larger than any we've yet uncovered? Did agriculture begin earlier than we think? Hidden now, beneath seas? Did complex societies rise and fall, erased before they could leave ruins on dry land? The answers may lie beneath waves, waiting for us to uncover them, or they may be gone forever, swallowed in silence. The sensory enormity of this lost earth is staggering. Imagine standing on a cliff today, looking out over the ocean, the salty air sharp in your lungs, the sound of waves crashing below. Now imagine that where the water stretches now, there were once forests, villages, children laughing by rivers, hunters stalking game across plains. Imagine the smell of wood smoke where today there is only salt spray. Imagine the warmth of fires that no longer burn. The ocean is not only water, it is a veil, covering worlds we can scarcely imagine. The flood did not just reshape land, it reshaped memory. It left us with a story that is incomplete, with whole chapters drowned. Every archaeological site we uncover on land is a fragment, the visible part of an iceberg whose mass lies unseen. And so, when we study the drowned shelves of India, the Mediterranean, the Sunda Shelf, Doggerland, we are not only learning geography, we are peering through a keyhole into the vastness of what was lost. The sunken world is a reminder of fragility. Civilization did not rise in a straight line, from simple to complex as a steady march. It was interrupted, drowned, erased again and again. For every site we celebrate as the first, there may have been others, earlier, grander, that lie hidden under seas. Perhaps our timeline is not the whole story, but only the surviving fragments. The rest sleeps beneath the waves, unreachable, untouchable, but no less real, and so the oceans remain not just boundaries, but vaults. They hold our history in their depths, preserving it in silence. Every sonar scan, every diver's discovery is a reminder that our past is larger than we know. Beneath the rolling surface, beneath the endless horizon, lies a world that once was ours. Forests, rivers, plains and homes, now hidden, waiting, or lost forever. The flood buried not just land, but perhaps history itself. And when we look out over the ocean today, we are not only seeing water, we are seeing memory, sealed in salt, stretching endlessly to the horizon, carrying the weight of worlds we can no longer touch. Long before the first cities rose, before writing etched words into clay, humanity's connections stretched like invisible threads across the land. These were not empires or kingdoms, not roads carved in stone or caravans heavy with goods. They were lighter, quieter, yet no less real. A shell passed from hand to hand until it reached mountains far from the sea. A piece of obsidian traded through valleys, gleaming black against the light. A story spoken in one tongue and then retold in another, altered but recognizable, carried like a spark from hearth to hearth. The world before the flood was smaller in number but vast in connection. Imagine standing on a low plain that once stretched between Britain and Europe. Doggerland, green and open. At its edge, a group of hunters meets another band. They exchange not only food or hides, but objects that hold meaning. Beads carved from bone, shells polished smooth by waves, stones chipped into blades finer than anything found nearby. The air is alive with the scent of roasting meat, the crackle of fire. Voices overlap in greetings, hands gesture to explain. Laughter breaks the silence of an evening that is both practical and ceremonial. This is trade not as industry, but as kinship, a way of binding strangers into a web of recognition. Such webs stretched farther than one might imagine. Archaeologists have found shells from Mediterranean coasts deep inland, far from their origin. Obsidian, volcanic glass born of fire, traveled across hundreds of miles, appearing in regions with no volcanoes at all. Each fragment tells us that the ancient world was not isolated tribes cut off in wilderness. It was a network, a living fabric of exchange. Along coasts, across plains, along river valleys, goods and ideas traveled with a quiet persistence, as natural as the flow of water. But the flood severed those threads. When the waters rose, coastlines vanished. Plains that had once been highways of travel and meeting were swallowed. Doggerland disappeared beneath the North Sea. The Sunda Shelf fractured into islands. The Persian Gulf basin filled with salt water, cutting off fertile lands and the people who had lived among them. Imagine standing at the edge of a rising tide, watching not only your home vanish, but the familiar route to other peoples, the track worn into earth by countless feet, now erased. The smell of salt carried inland with each surge was not just the loss of food or shelter, but the loss of connection. Trade is more than goods. It is knowledge, it is technique, it is memory shared. When those routes drowned, innovation slowed. A tool once passed from group to group now had to be reinvented. A story once spread across valleys now grew silent, confined to one place. Isolation deepened. Groups cut off by water became strangers once more, reinventing what had already been discovered elsewhere, or forgetting what they could no longer sustain. The flood was not only a natural disaster, but a cultural collapse. Picture the silence of an island newly formed, where once it was connected to a greater land. The people wake to a horizon of water, where yesterday there had been forests and plains. Their neighbors are gone. The air feels heavier, lonelier. Fires burn, but the circle is smaller. Ideas that once flowed outward now spiral inward, contained. It is not extinction, but it is contraction. Civilization, in a sense, had to begin again, and yet, even in collapse, resilience lingered. Groups adapted to their new isolation. On islands, they learned seafaring, building rafts and canoes to reach out once more. On river valleys, they turned inward, perfecting farming and irrigation. The flood delayed connections, but it did not destroy the human instinct to reach, to share, to connect. It simply forced it to take new forms, slower, more fragile, yet still alive. The sensory cost of broken trade is hard to measure, but easy to feel when imagined. The absence of familiar voices at a gathering place. The emptiness of a fire once shared by many groups, now tended by only one. The lack of new objects, no strange shells glinting in the light, no stone of unfamiliar color, no beads carved in patterns you had not seen before. The world grew smaller, narrower, muted. It may be that civilization's timeline was delayed by this collapse. Connections fuel innovation. Shared ideas ignite progress. When networks break, the spark takes longer to spread. Perhaps farming arose in some drowned plain, practiced for centuries before being lost to waves. Perhaps a ritual, a form of counting, a method of storage, vanished before it could take root elsewhere. What we call the beginning of civilization may in fact be a rebirth, a second attempt after the first was drowned. The echoes of this cultural collapse still ripple in myth and memory. Stories of great floods often speak not only of loss of land, but of loss of knowledge, of a world reset, cleansed, begun anew. These may be symbolic ways of remembering the broken web of connection, the silence where once there was exchange. In myth, as in life, the flood was not just water, but erasure, forcing humanity to rebuild from fragments, and yet humanity did rebuild. Slowly, trade routes formed again. Rivers replaced drowned coasts as highways. Canoes stitched islands back into networks. Inland valleys became hubs, fertile grounds, drawing people together once more. Shells still traveled. Obsidian still gleamed in faraway lands. The fabric was woven again, thread by thread. But it took centuries, even millennia. Civilization rose later than it might have, delayed by the relentless rise of water. The flood teaches us that progress is not guaranteed, not inevitable. It can be broken, scattered, drowned. Yet it also shows us that the instinct to connect, to trade, to share knowledge is as resilient as survival itself. Even in silence, people dreamed of reaching outward. Even in isolation, they built the skills to connect again. Imagine the first canoe carved after the flood, the feel of wood rough under calloused hands, the sound of water lapping against its sides. A group pushes it into the river, uncertain, their hearts pounding as they drift toward another shore. When they arrive, they are met not with hostility, but with recognition, a spark reignited, a thread restored. Trade begins again, not as it was before, but as it could be, woven through rivers and seas, no longer bound to drowned plains. And so, though the flood broke connections, it did not erase the human need for them. It delayed, it silenced, it scattered. But in time, the web grew back, stronger for its regrowth. Civilization may have been delayed, but it was not denied. The flood had broken the threads, but humanity's hands never ceased weaving. When the great flood reshaped the earth, when coasts dissolved and herds vanished into extinction, humanity clung to its most ancient allies. Fire, shelter, and kinship. These were the anchors against a world that seemed intent on erasing everything else. In the endless uncertainty of rising waters, they were constants, small, fragile, yet powerful enough to carry humanity through storms of both water and time. Picture a camp at night, high above a valley newly claimed by the sea. The air is sharp with the chill of evening, scented with pine resin and damp earth. In the center of a circle of stones, a fire glows, its embers breathing warmth into the cold. Flames bend and sway with the rhythm of the wind, their light painting the faces gathered around them. The crackle of burning wood, the hiss of sap, the occasional pop as bark splits, these sounds become the heartbeat of survival. Around the fire, fear softens. Stories are told, food is shared, warmth is passed from one body to another. In a world unraveling, fire became memory, safety, and promise. But fire was more than warmth. It was protection. In forests, now teeming with predators displaced from drowned coasts, fire was the line between safety and danger. The glow of flames kept wolves at bay, their eyes gleaming just beyond the shadows. Sparks leapt upward, carrying with them reassurance that darkness would not consume. The smell of smoke, once a simple byproduct, became a comfort. The scent of survival itself, woven into hair, into hides, into the very fabric of daily life. And fire was transformation. Meat roasted over flames, not only fed but nourished more deeply, its fibers softened, its taste richer. Roots, bitter when raw, turned sweet when baked beneath embers. Grains, hard to chew, softened into porridge when boiled with heated stones. Cooking stretched the limits of what could be eaten, broadening diets, turning scarcity into sustenance. Each meal was a lesson in ingenuity, each flavor a sign that humanity was learning to wrest abundance from meager offerings. As fire anchored the nights, shelter anchored the days. The flood had forced people inland, away from coasts and plains where mobility once defined life. With movement curtailed, with landscapes unfamiliar, groups began to build differently. Imagine the feel of mud pressed between hands, shaped into walls that hardened under the sun. Imagine the texture of woven reeds, bent into frames, layered with hides waterproofed by rendered fat. Shelters became sturdier, semi-permanent, their presence marking humanity's first hesitations toward settlement. On high ridges, stone circles rose, walls thick enough to resist storms, roofs thatched with grass or bark. Families pressed close inside, their voices low against the wind. The scent inside was of smoke and damp hides, of soil trekked in on feet, of warmth trapped against the cold. These shelters were more than practical. They were sanctuaries, womb-like spaces that shielded against not only weather but despair. To step inside was to step into continuity, into a place where the flood could not reach, where memories of home could be carried forward. Innovation flourished under pressure. Hides, once draped simply for warmth, were treated with oils and fats, becoming waterproof against rain. New cooking methods emerged, steaming food under layers of leaves, drying strips of meat into tough but lasting stores. Stone tools were shaped sharper, finer, designed not only for hunting, but for carving wood, building, crafting. The clink of flint against flint, the scrape of bone against hide, the rhythm of hands weaving reeds into mats, these became the music of survival. Families too became closer. Clans clustered tighter, their bonds hardened by shared loss. Imagine a shelter packed with voices, children pressed against elders, every space filled with life. The warmth of body against body became as important as the warmth of fire. In scarcity, cooperation was not optional, it was life. Tasks were shared, some gathering wood, some tending fire, some preparing food, some watching the horizon. Survival was no longer a solitary act, but a collective rhythm, each person a note in a song that had to be sung together. The sensory world of this resilience was intimate, the feel of smoke clinging to skin, the warmth of hides wrapped tight against shoulders, the taste of food flavored with ash and ember, the sound of wind rattling through reed walls. Each detail etched itself into memory, a reminder that life endured not in grand gestures, but in small continuities. A flame kept burning, a roof kept standing, a story told to soothe a frightened child. In these moments, innovation thrived not as invention, but as adaptation. Waterproofing hides, sealing clay vessels to hold water, weaving tighter nets for fishing in inland rivers. These were simple acts, born of necessity, yet they were also seeds of progress. Humanity learned not only to endure, but to transform the very conditions of survival into tools of growth. Each solution was passed on, refined, remembered, and slowly the patchwork of adaptations became a fabric strong enough to carry humanity into the future. The flood had stripped life down to its essentials, but in those essentials lay resilience. Fire, shelter, family, these were not luxuries. They were the pillars that held humanity above the waters. Around fires, in shelters, within families, knowledge was preserved. The memory of drowned coasts was spoken in stories, the lessons of survival passed into ritual, the hope of continuity woven into every spark and stone. Close your eyes and imagine again that campfire, high on a ridge above a drowned plain. The stars glitter sharp above, their light ancient, their silence immense. The air is cool, filled with the mingling sense of smoke and earth. Inside the shelter, voices murmur, soft, tired, but alive. A child drifts to sleep, their breath steady, their body curled against their mother's side. Outside the fire glows steady, a fragile light in a vast darkness. That light is the story of humanity, small, flickering, but unyielding, carrying warmth into the endless night. Across every horizon, where land meets sea, the human imagination has whispered of cities lost beneath the waves. The names are many, shaped by culture and language. Atlantis, Kumari Kandam, Lemuria, High Brazil, Wues, and dozens more. Some shimmer with detail in myth, described as radiant places of towers and palaces. Others are vague, their outlines blurred like dreams half remembered. What unites them all is the same haunting theme. The sea came, and it took everything. These myths are often dismissed as fantasy, stories spun to entertain, to warn, to moralize. And yet, when placed against the backdrop of the great floods, they take on a different resonance. Perhaps they are not inventions, but magnifications of truth. Perhaps, behind their exaggerations, they preserve memories of real places swallowed by water, their survival in culture no less miraculous than the survival of fire or food. Imagine standing on the shore of the Aegean, listening to the waves brush against stone. In Plato's telling, Atlantis lay beyond these waters, a mighty civilization, rich and proud, destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophe. For centuries, people have argued whether Plato was recounting allegory or history. But to those who survived the floods of 12,000 years ago, the story would not have sounded impossible. They had watched valleys sink, had seen rivers swallow their homes, had stood at the edge of new seas where plains had been. They did not need to invent lost cities. They had lived them. Travel further east, to the southern tip of India, where Tamil legends tell of Kumari Kandam, a vast fertile land stretching far into the Indian Ocean, home to ancient dynasties and poets lost beneath the waves. Today, sonar scans reveal drowned landscapes off the Indian coast, where rivers once flowed across plains now smothered in salt water. Whether Kumari Kandam was real or imagined, the geography beneath the waves tells us that memory and myth may share the same roots. The land did vanish, its people did scatter, and their stories echo still. In the Pacific, stories of Lemuria speak of a vast land that connected continents, inhabited by a people of wisdom. To modern science, Lemuria as an entire continent is not real. Plate tectonics leaves no room for it. But the Pacific and Indian Oceans do hold drowned archipelagos, chains of islands swallowed by rising seas. Imagine a culture thriving there, its memory fractured and carried outward by survivors to many shores. Over time, fragments become fables, and fables become myths of lost continents. The sensory weight of these myths is not abstract. Picture the sound of waves breaking against ruins, stones smoothed by centuries of tide. Picture the sight of pillars half buried in sand, glimpsed in moments of low tide, or the faint shadow of straight lines revealed on the seabed by sonar. Picture the silence beneath the water, where once there was laughter, where the air once held the smoke of cooking fires. Myth magnifies, but beneath it is the intimate ache of loss, carried from generation to generation. What makes these myths powerful is not whether they are true in the literal sense. It is that they reveal the psychological impact of the flood. entire worlds disappeared. For survivors, it was not just land that was lost, but identity, community, memory. To lose a home is one thing, to lose an entire homeland is another. The grief was vast enough to demand epic telling, and so ordinary villages became imagined as cities, drowned coasts became continents, the loss of hundreds became stories of entire civilizations gone, and yet, even as trauma transformed into myth, myth in turn shaped culture. Flood stories, often worn of pride, of civilizations grown too arrogant, punished by the gods, humbled by the waters. But beneath the moral lessons lies an older truth, that water is unstoppable, that nature reshapes even the greatest of human efforts. These stories became cautionary tales, not just for one people, but for all, reminders whispered through time that the sea can take everything. Some myths are astonishing in their detail. In the Pacific Northwest of the Americas, indigenous stories tell of great floods that covered the land, of people clinging to mountain tops, of canoes tied to trees to survive the rising waters. In Australia, Aboriginal tales speak of seas swallowing coastal plains, of ancestors watching the shoreline retreat inland. These stories, passed orally for millennia, align with geological evidence of rising seas in those exact regions. To dismiss them as mere myth is to overlook the possibility that memory can last not just centuries, but tens of thousands of years, carried in song and story with remarkable precision. Archaeology adds its own quiet chorus. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument lies submerged, massive stone structures that some argue are natural, others human-made. Off India's coast, near Dwarka, divers have found stone walls and streets now lying deep underwater. Off the Mediterranean, ruins rest beneath the waves near Alexandria and in the Bay of Naples. Each discovery ignites debate. Are they proof of the lost cities of myth, or simply the remnants of settlements erased by rising seas? Either way, they remind us that myth and memory need not be separate. They may be two lenses, one poetic and one material, focused on the same vanished truth. The psychological wound of the flood was not healed quickly. Imagine generations living inland, telling their children of the land that once stretched beyond the horizon, of villages now buried beneath waves. For those children, the drowned land was not memory, but inheritance, a story of loss too immense to fully comprehend. Over time, those stories swelled, absorbing imagination, becoming myths of lost golden ages. Memory blurred into legend, but the emotional truth remained. The flood had taken worlds. In this way, the lost megacities of memory are not only about the past, they are mirrors, reflecting our own fragility. Each time we tell the story of Atlantis, of Kumari Kandam, of Lemuria, we are not only imagining what was lost, we are warning ourselves of what can be lost again. The myths endure because the fear endures. The sea is still there, vast and patient, lapping at our shores, reminding us that its reach has not ended. The sensory echo lingers in us still. The sound of waves can soothe, but it can also unsettle. The sight of ruins, half submerged, fascinates because it feels like revelation, like the veil of myth lifting, the smell of salt on the air, the feel of sand beneath feet. These are ordinary experiences, yet they connect us to ancestors who once watched their world dissolve into the same sea. Whether the lost megacities were real cities or only villages magnified in the imagination, they are part of us. They show that trauma is never only destruction, it is also creation, of stories, of warnings, of meaning. Humanity transformed its greatest wound into myth, and in doing so ensured that it would never be forgotten. So when we speak of Atlantis, of Kumari Kandam, of Lemuria, we are not speaking only of fantasy. We are speaking of grief preserved, of memory magnified, of the sea's power acknowledged. Beneath the exaggerations lies a truth as vast as the ocean, that whole worlds were lost, and that humanity carries their ghosts still, in story, in song, in silence. The flood was not just physical destruction. It was a cultural wound, remembered as the loss of entire worlds. Worlds that may have been humble villages, or may have been grander than we can now imagine. Either way, they remain alive, not beneath the waves alone, but in our minds, in our myths, in the stories we continue to tell, even now. As the waters advanced and the lowlands disappeared, humanity did not simply face the rising tide. It faced itself. The seas pushed people into valleys, onto plateaus, into river basins, where the land was still fertile and the water still drinkable. What had once been wide open spaces became narrow. The great plains were gone, the coasts drowned, and now the survivors pressed shoulder to shoulder into places that could not always hold them. Imagine a river valley, green and abundant, its banks heavy with reeds, its waters alive with fish. The air is thick with the hum of insects, the croak of frogs, the rustle of birds darting through the canopy. It is a place that can feed many, but not all. As groups arrive from drowned coasts, carrying their fires and tools, the valley begins to crowd. Families who had lived there for generations find strangers camping on the edges of their hunting grounds. Paths once walked in solitude now echo with the footsteps of others. The smell of smoke rises not from one fire but from dozens, and slowly tension builds. Competition was not new to humanity. Even in earlier ages, disputes over food, water, and territory arose, but now the pressure was greater, the margins tighter, the stakes higher. The flood had reduced the world's habitable land, forcing populations to overlap in ways they never had before. Where once distance had softened rivalry, closeness sharpened it. The clatter of stone on stone, once the sound of tool-making, became the sound of weapons. Archaeological evidence bears silent witness to this shift. Mass graves from the end of the Ice Age show bodies marked by trauma, skulls pierced by arrows, bones fractured by clubs. Sites that had been peaceful for generations now tell stories of sudden, violent ends. In some valleys, entire groups seem to vanish from the record, replaced by others who moved in. The flood was not only water, it was the spark that turned survival into struggle, turning neighbor against neighbor when resources grew thin. And yet, conflict was not only destruction. In its fire, new bonds were forged. Within groups, unity deepened. Imagine the circle of a clan gathered around a fire, the air heavy with smoke and fear, voices low as they decide how to defend themselves against the strangers beyond the ridge. In those moments, family became more than blood. It became survival. Cooperation was no longer optional. It was the shield against violence. Shared hunting, shared food, shared defense, these became the glue that held groups together. The sensory world of conflict was sharp and unforgettable. The hiss of arrows through air, the sharp metallic scent of blood on earth, the shouts of battle breaking the stillness of morning. But alongside it came the warmth of shared meals after danger had passed, the embrace of kin returning alive, the fragile relief of peace bought for one more night. Violence and unity walked hand in hand, inseparable in this crucible of survival. Warfare in these early ages was not organized in the way we think of it today. There were no armies, no lines of battle. It was sudden, chaotic, intimate. Clashes of small bands, ambushes in forests, skirmishes along rivers. Weapons were simple. Stone-tipped spears, bows strung with sinew, clubs carved from hardwood. The texture of combat was rough, brutal, close, and yet, even here, humanity was inventing. New tools of war emerged, sharper blades, stronger bows, tactics born from desperation. Violence drove innovation, just as hunger had driven cooking and shelter. But as much as violence fractured, it also taught diplomacy. Not every encounter ended in blood. Sometimes groups recognized that unity was stronger than rivalry. Alliances formed, tentative at first, sealed with gifts or shared hunts. The smell of roasting meat replaced the smell of blood. The sound of laughter replaced the cries of battle. These were fragile truces, easily broken, but they planted seeds of something greater. The first diplomacy, the first recognition that cooperation across groups could be as valuable as cooperation within them. The flood, then, was more than a natural test, it was a human one. Could people endure not only the rising seas, but the rising tension of crowding, scarcity, and fear? Could they find ways to live alongside strangers, or would they destroy one another in the struggle? The answer, as the record shows, was both. Many perished in conflict, their stories ending in silence, but others found ways to endure, to weave alliances, to share knowledge. Out of chaos came the first hints of organized society, born not in peace but in struggle. Imagine again that crowded valley. Two groups meet at the riverbank. Their bodies are tense, their voices sharp. For a moment it seems violence will erupt, but one leader steps forward carrying an offering, a string of shells, a tool chipped from rare obsidian. The air is thick with silence, the smell of wet earth rising from the river. Slowly the other leader accepts, weapons lower. A fragile bridge is built, not of stone or wood, but of trust. That moment, repeated in countless variations across the world, was the beginning of something new. Organized diplomacy, the first weaving of threads between rival groups. The emotional cost of conflict lingered, though. Children grew up with stories of raids, of kin lost, of nights spent in fear. Those memories shaped culture, turning into warnings, into rituals meant to prevent violence, into myths that explained why strangers were dangerous. The flood carved wounds not only into the land, but into the human psyche. To this day, echoes of that age linger in our instinct to fear the other, to guard what is ours. And yet, just as fire and shelter carried humanity through the flood, so too did unity. Violence may have scarred, but cooperation healed. From conflict rose organization, leaders chosen not by chance, but by strength or wisdom, rules agreed upon to prevent endless bloodshed, ceremonies created to seal alliances. The very foundations of society, governance, law, diplomacy, were born from the chaos of rising seas and crowded valleys. Close your eyes and imagine standing in that valley once more. The air is heavy with the smell of rain, the river swollen from melted glaciers. On one bank, a group sharpens their weapons. On the other, a group tends their fires. Tension hums in the air, like the stillness before a storm, and then, slowly, cautiously, they walk toward one another. What happens next will decide not only their survival, but the survival of their descendants. Violence may erupt, or peace may be forged. Either way, the flood has forced them to decide, to shape their future in the crucible of competition. The flood tested humanity's ability not only to endure nature, but to endure each other, and from that test came both blood and bonds. It was a time of struggle, of loss, of fear, but also of invention, of unity, of the first organized societies rising from the ashes of conflict. The flood did not give humanity a choice to avoid competition. It only gave the choice of how to face it, through destruction or through creation. When the waters rose and reshaped the earth, humanity sought not only survival in fire, food, and shelter, but survival in meaning. The flood was more than a disaster of land and water. It was a mystery. Why had the seas swallowed the world? Why had the skies poured down without mercy? Why had some survived, while others vanished? In the silence after the deluge, people turned to ritual and religion to answer what reason alone could not. Imagine a family gathered at the edge of a river that has swollen beyond its banks. The air is damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and moss. Mist clings to the surface of the water, curling upward like smoke. A child tosses a carved figurine into the current, a gift, an offering. The splash echoes softly, swallowed by the river's flow. Around them, the family whispers words they scarcely understand, words passed down by ancestors who remembered the time when the waters consumed entire worlds. In that moment, ritual becomes not just practice, but memory, a way to speak to forces larger than themselves, and to the generations yet unborn. The flood carved itself into religion everywhere, from Mesopotamia to India, from the Pacific Islands to the Americas. Gods of water and storm rose in prominence. The sea was no longer only a provider of fish or a path of travel. It was a force of judgment, a being with will and fury. Myths of deluge carried both fear and reverence. Water as punishment, water as renewal, water as the boundary between death and rebirth. Temples rose near rivers, their stones carved with symbols of waves, rain, and serpents. The texture of carved stone under fingertips, cool and rough, was not mere decoration. It was a reminder, a warning etched into sacred walls. In Egypt, the Nile became the center of faith, its annual flooding worshipped as both destruction and blessing. In time, Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose as man-made mountains, their very height a gesture against the memory of rising seas, stairways reaching toward the sky to escape what lay below. In India, the god Vishnu took the form of Matsya, the great fish who saved Manu from the waters, an eternal reminder that divinity had once intervened to preserve humanity. Religion was comfort, but it was also instruction. Flood myths often told of divine punishment for arrogance, for violence, for forgetting humility before nature. They taught that water would rise again if balance was broken. The stories were not simply laments of past trauma, but living warnings, carried in song and prayer, binding each generation to the memory of disaster. Picture a ritual at the shore of a lake. The water glimmers silver under the moon, its surface broken only by ripples. A priestess stands barefoot in the shallows, her skin prickling with cold, the water swirling around her ankles. In her hands she holds grain, wrapped in leaves. With slow movements she lowers the offering, letting it drift out across the water. Behind her, the people kneel in silence, the air filled with the crackling of torches. The ritual is not only for the gods, it is for memory, for continuity, for the assurance that the waters will not rise again unchecked. Archaeology whispers of these practices in fragments. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, great stone circles carved with animals, serpents, vultures, foxes, suggest ritual bound tightly to survival and cosmic order, built just after the time when the floods reshaped the world. In the Pacific, oral traditions of Polynesian peoples still tell of canoes lashed to mountain peaks to survive the deluge, with prayers to gods of sea and storm echoing through generations. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines recall coasts swallowed by water, woven into sacred geography, still remembered tens of thousands of years later. Each ritual, each story, each prayer is both memory and defiance. To tell the tale of the flood is to ensure it is not forgotten, to keep alive the knowledge that water can destroy. To offer gifts to rivers and seas is to plead for mercy, to remind the forces of nature that humanity remembers, that it will not grow too proud again. The sensory weight of these echoes is profound. The scent of incense curling in the temple air, the sound of waves breaking against sacred shrines built at the water's edge, the roughness of clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped cuneiform, preserving stories of Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, the sight of floodplains stretching beneath temple walls, green and fertile because the river has receded, yet fertile only because it once rose in destruction. Every detail, every sensation reinforced the bond between water, worship, and memory. For ancient people, religion was not abstract. It was tactile, immediate. To build a temple near a river was to live each year with the reminder that the waters gave, and the waters could take. To tell the story of Noah or Manu or Deucalion was not simply myth but survival instruction. Keep humility, build boats, climb high when the water rises. Faith was born not in comfort, but in necessity, in the desperate need to make sense of a world that could vanish in a single storm. Over time, these flood echoes shaped entire cosmologies. In Mesopotamia, the world was imagined as a disk of land surrounded by cosmic waters, always threatening to surge inward. In Hindu cosmology, time itself was cyclical, with worlds destroyed by floods before being reborn anew. In the Pacific, ancestors were remembered as sailors who braved storms and waves, guided by gods across endless seas. The flood was no longer only an event. It became a structure of thought, a way of seeing the universe as fragile, impermanent, always at risk of drowning. And yet, these same echoes gave hope, for if the flood could destroy, it could also renew. Just as rivers left fertile soil when they receded, so too could destruction give way to rebirth. Flood myths often end not in silence but in survival, with a chosen few saved to carry humanity forward. This duality, water as death, water as life, became the heartbeat of religion. It was fear, yes, but also resilience, the promise that from loss comes continuity. Close your eyes and imagine stepping into an ancient temple at dawn. The air is cool, filled with the scent of damp stone. Shadows cling to carvings of waves and serpents on the walls. Outside, the river glimmers, its surface painted gold by the rising sun. Inside, voices chant softly, a rhythm like the lap of water against shore. Each word, each gesture is both worship and remembrance. The flood lives on, not in water, but in ritual, echoing across time. The flood left scars on the earth, but it also left scars on the spirit. Those scars became sacred, inscribed into religion, carried forward in song, myth, architecture, and prayer. Even now, millennia later, when we hear stories of divine punishment by water, of salvation from a great flood, we are hearing not only myth but memory, the voice of ancestors who endured the greatest trial, whispering their warning through ritual to ensure we never forget. The waters receded, but the rituals remained. The seas calmed, but the prayers continued, and in that continuity, humanity found both comfort and caution, both meaning and memory. The flood lived on not only in stone and soil, but in faith itself, shaping the way people understood the divine, the natural, and their own fragile place between them. When the flood waters at last began to settle, when the coasts had redrawn themselves, and the seas had claimed their new dominion, humanity found itself changed. What had been drowned was not only land, but the way of life that land had sustained. Hunting grounds were gone, vast plains reduced to memory, fertile lowlands lost beneath salt water. In their place were rivers, swollen, fertile, alive with both promise and danger. The flood which had nearly ended humanity now pressed it into a transformation so profound that the shape of civilization itself would never be the same. Imagine the Nile in its earliest days after the flood, a ribbon of water glimmering beneath a sky washed clean by dawn. The air is thick with the smell of wet silt, dark and heavy, left behind as the waters retreat each year. Along its banks families gather, their feet sinking into the cool mud. They scatter seeds into the earth, not as a ritual, but as necessity. Days later, shoots rise, green against the brown soil, a fragile promise of food to come. For the first time, survival no longer depends solely on the chase of herds or the harvest of wild berries. It depends on patience, on tending, on learning to trust the soil itself. The flood forced humanity inland, concentrating it in valleys like these. The Tigris and Euphrates, winding through Mesopotamia, became lifelines. The Indus, broad and wild, carried its waters across plains that would soon hold villages. The Yellow River, restless and unpredictable, nonetheless fed the first experiments in farming in China. Each river was a reminder of destruction, floods that once drowned entire worlds, but also of renewal. The same waters that had taken so much now offered fertility in return. The irony was not lost even then. Water had been the destroyer, and now it was the teacher. The agricultural revolution did not begin because it was easier. Hunting and gathering had been humanity's rhythm for tens of thousands of years, a way of life honed to perfection. It began because the old ways were drowned. The great plains where herds once thundered were gone. Forests that had fed countless families were reduced. The sea had erased certainty, and so people adapted. With fewer wild resources, they turned inward, to the soil, to seeds, to animals they could keep close. Necessity drove innovation, and innovation became transformation. Picture a village rising slowly along a riverbank. The shelters are sturdier now, their walls thick with mud brick, their roofs thatched with reeds. Smoke curls into the evening sky from many hearths at once, carrying with it the smell of roasting grain and stew simmering with herbs. Children chase one another between rows of sprouting wheat, their laughter mingling with the hum of insects in the twilight air. The sound of grinding stones echoes as women crush grain into flour, their hands powdered white, their rhythm steady and soothing. These are the first permanent homes, the first permanent meals, the first permanence humanity had ever known. Animals, too, became part of this revolution. Goats, once wild and wary, were tamed, their milk warm and sustaining. Sheep provided wool, soft and insulating, spun into threads that warmed the body against chill nights. Oxen, massive and steady, were yoked to pull weight, their strength transforming labor into possibility. The smell of animals filled the villages, pungent and earthy, a new kind of intimacy between human and beast. Once hunted, they were now partners in survival, shaping the daily rhythm of work and sustenance. This new life was not without cost. Farming demanded discipline, the back bent beneath sun, the hands blistered from tools, the body tethered to soil in a way hunters had never known. Crops failed, pests came, droughts followed floods. Yet even with its risks, farming offered something hunters had never had: surplus. For the first time, families could store food, clay jars filled with grain waiting for the lean months. This surplus meant survival was no longer only day-to-day. It meant planning, dreaming, imagining futures not only for tomorrow, but for seasons, for years. With surplus came time. Not all hands were needed in the fields at once. Some turned to craft, to shaping pottery, smooth and round, the cool clay forming beneath their fingers. Others chipped stone into sharper tools, carved bone into needles, wove reeds into baskets so tight they could hold water. Some turned to art, to carving figures of gods or animals, painting symbols on walls, singing songs that remembered both the flood and the renewal after it. The flood had taken much, but it had given this, the spark of culture ignited by the safety of stored food. Religion, too, changed with farming. Rivers became sacred, not only feared as destroyers, but revered as givers of life. Temples rose on their banks, adorned with carvings of waves and fertility, their stones cool under the sun, their courtyards filled with offerings of grain and water. Rituals shifted from hunting rites to planting festivals, the air alive with chants, the smell of burning incense mixing with the sweetness of new growth. The flood had scarred memory, but agriculture gave it meaning, weaving destruction and creation into one eternal cycle. The sensory landscape of this revolution was immense. The rough texture of grinding stones, their surfaces worn smooth by years of flower making, the sweet grassy scent of fields of barley rippling in the breeze, their heads heavy with grain, the warmth of sun-baked mud bricks beneath the palm, holding the day's heat into the cool of night, the taste of bread, coarse but filling, a flavor unknown to ancestors who had eaten only what they gathered, the sound of water channeled into irrigation ditches, trickling like a promise of survival into fields. Every sense was engaged, every moment bound to the land in new ways. The agricultural revolution was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, over centuries. Some groups embraced it fully, building villages that grew into towns. Others resisted, clinging to the freedom of hunting and gathering, roaming forests and highlands where farming was impossible. But the tide was irreversible. Surplus meant growth, and growth meant more people, more villages, more connections. Farming was not easier. It was simply inescapable. The flood had destroyed, but in its wake it left no choice but to build anew. Close your eyes and imagine the dawn of one of these river villages. The air is cool, carrying the scent of dew on fields. Mist drifts low, veiling the thatched roofs in soft haze. A rooster crows, its cry sharp against the stillness. Slowly the village wakes, the scrape of pots, the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices greeting the day. Across the fields, green rows stretch into distance, their lines straight and ordered, a human imprint on the land that once belonged only to nature. And beyond them the river flows, endless, patient, carrying with it both the memory of destruction and the promise of renewal. The flood was destruction, but it was also ignition. It pressed humanity into corners, and in those corners humanity found permanence. It drowned the old ways, and from those depths rose the first villages, the first farms, the first cities waiting in seed. What began as necessity became revolution, forever altering human destiny. The flood had nearly ended the story. Instead, it became the prologue to civilization itself. Every drop of rain that falls, every wave that breaks on the shore, carries with it a memory. The global flood, 12,000 years ago, was not only a disaster of its time, it was a message written into the earth itself, a lesson carved in rivers, in stone, in DNA, and in myth. The waters rose and humanity endured, but not unchanged. They adapted, they suffered, they rebuilt. The flood was both wound and teacher, both destruction and revelation, and its lessons are not lost. They remain, waiting for us to hear them again. Imagine standing on the edge of a modern sea, the horizon stretching endlessly, its surface calm, glittering under sunlight. The salty breeze carries the scent of kelp and brine, the cry of gulls rising above the steady hiss of waves. It feels eternal, unchanging, yet we know, and our ancestors knew, that seas are never still. They advance, they retreat, they redraw the world as easily as an artist reshapes a canvas. To believe the shoreline permanent is to forget the memory written in water. The first lesson is fragility. Humanity once believed itself safe upon coasts and plains, hunting across lands that stretched far beyond today's maps. They built their lives on what seemed eternal, and then, in the span of centuries, the blink of a geological eye, it was gone. Valleys drowned, rivers shifted, forests vanished. The world they had known dissolved, and with it the certainty of their place within it. We too live with certainties that may not endure. Cities pressed against the sea, fields carved from deltas, homes balanced near rivers. Our ancestors would remind us, nothing is fixed, not even the ground beneath our feet. The second lesson is resilience. Though the flood took much, it did not take all. Humanity bent, but did not break. They climbed higher, built anew, learned new ways of life. The memory of water was passed through myth not only as warning, but as testament. We survived this once, we may survive again. Imagine the sound of their voices, telling children of drowned worlds, not only in sorrow but in strength. The smell of smoke rising from their fires was proof that life endured. The taste of bread from newly cultivated grain was proof that innovation could follow loss. Resilience is not denial of fragility. It is the art of living within it. The third lesson is adaptation. When the seas advanced, people did not cling forever to vanished coasts. They moved, they changed, they let go of what could not be saved. Doggerland was drowned, but Britain survived. The Sunda Shelf fractured, but its islands became new homes. The Persian Gulf basin filled, but the rivers that fed it still sustained life. Adaptation meant survival, not in holding to the past, but in shaping the future from what remained. The texture of adaptation was rough, difficult, often painful, calloused hands, building new homes, weary bodies, learning new routines, families grieving what was gone, yet without it there would be no us. Today, as seas rise once again, these lessons matter. We live in a time when the ice melts faster than even our ancestors witnessed, when storms carve coastlines, when islands shrink beneath the tide. In the hum of modern cities, in the rush of traffic, it is easy to forget the old warnings. But the earth remembers the geology of drowned valleys, the myths of great floods, the genetic scars of population bottlenecks, all whisper the same truth. We are vulnerable. The flood was not an allegory. It was a preview. Close your eyes and imagine hearing that whisper, the sound of waves at night lapping against sea walls, the faint creak of wood on a dock rocking gently. The air smells of salt, tinged with the faint metallic tang of rusting iron. Beneath these ordinary sensations lies the memory of catastrophe. To stand by the sea is to stand on the edge of ancient history, to feel the echo of waters that once climbed higher and higher until they took whole worlds. That echo is not past, it is present, reminding us that the waters can always return. The myths preserved this lesson in ways science now echoes. Gilgamesh's flood, Noah's Ark, Manu's rescue by the great fish, these are not only stories of divine punishment, they are memory turned sacred, knowledge made eternal through ritual. The water will rise again, the myths say. Be ready. For ancient peoples, readiness meant offerings, rituals, stories passed to children. For us, readiness must mean something different, understanding the science, preparing the coasts, rethinking our place on this shifting earth. Yet the root is the same, memory as protection, story as survival. What the flood also teaches is humility. Humanity was small before the ocean. Every fire seemed fragile against the night, every shelter temporary against the storm. That humility carried wisdom, a respect for forces beyond control, a reverence for the cycles of earth. Today, in towers of steel and glass, in cities blazing with light, it is easy to forget humility. The flood's lesson whispers otherwise. We are powerful, yes, but not greater than water, not greater than climate, not greater than earth itself. There is also a quieter lesson, one of perspective. The flood reminds us that civilization is not a straight line. It is fragile, interrupted, delayed. The knowledge we have today may not be all there ever was. Entire ways of life may lie drowned, forgotten, erased beneath waves. This means that what we call beginnings may be rebirths, what we call firsts may be seconds or thirds. The flood humbles history as much as it humbles humanity, showing us that memory is incomplete, that much lies hidden, and that what endures is not always what began. The sensory richness of these lessons lingers in imagination, the sight of waves stretching toward a horizon, the sound of rain on rooftops, steady and endless, the feel of damp earth beneath bare feet after a storm, the scent of rivers swollen with spring melt. Each sensation ties us back to ancestors who felt the same, who understood water not only as life but as danger, not only as gift but as warning. These sensations are bridges across time, carrying the lessons of the flood into our own lives. And yet there is hope written in water as well. For if the flood was destruction, it was also renewal. The same waters that drowned coasts left behind fertile valleys. The same loss that erased hunting grounds gave rise to farming. The same trauma that scarred cultures birthed myths that bound humanity together. Hope is written alongside warning, inseparable as two sides of the same wave. Humanity survived not only because it adapted, but because it found meaning, even in loss. Close your eyes and imagine standing in a modern city built on a coast. New York, Shanghai, Mumbai. The lights glitter like stars reflected on the water. The air hums with voices, engines, life. Beneath this noise, beneath the hum of electricity, the ocean waits, vast and silent. It has been here before. It has risen before. The flood whispers, learn from us, prepare, do not forget. Every story we tell of the ancient flood is not only about the past. It is about now, about the future, about whether we will repeat the same mistakes or find a new way forward. The global flood teaches us resilience, fragility, and adaptation. It shows us that climate change is not abstract, not distant. It reshapes everything in mere centuries. Our ancestors endured by abandoning certainties, by building anew, by transforming loss into innovation. The question is whether we can do the same, whether we can heed the lessons written in water, or whether we, like them, will be caught unprepared when the waves return. The flood's voice is quiet, but it is insistent. It speaks in myths, it speaks in stone, it speaks in the DNA carried in every cell. It speaks in the sigh of waves on every shore. And it asks us, will you listen this time? By the time the waters calmed, by the time the earth had drawn new coastlines and the seas had settled into the basins, a different humanity stood upon its shores. 10,000 years ago, the world exhaled after its long drowning. The chaos of collapse gave way to stillness, and in that stillness, the survivors emerged not only alive, but transformed. Imagine the morning light over a new coast. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of salt and silt. Waves roll gently against cliffs freshly carved by the retreating flood. Where once there had been forests or plains, now there is water stretching to the horizon. Yet on the high ridges above, smoke curls skyward from small fires, thin threads of human presence against the immensity of the sea. Around those fires sit the descendants of survivors, weary, watchful, and yet in their silence carrying something immense, endurance, memory, and the first sparks of rebirth. Humanity after the flood was smaller. Populations had shrunk, villages had vanished, entire peoples had been erased. But those who remained carried not only themselves, they carried stories, tools, seeds, and above all knowledge. They had endured catastrophe, and in doing so had learned what no generation before them had known, that survival is not just persistence, but transformation. The new coasts were different. Where fertile plains had once stretched, now there were bays and estuaries, alive with fish and shellfish. Where rivers had been choked by ice, they now flowed freely, their banks thick with reeds, their deltas rich with silt. Forests grew where glaciers had retreated, their canopies alive with birdsong, the air sweet with sap and blossoms. The earth itself seemed to have been remade, both familiar and utterly strange. For humans, this strangeness was opportunity. The flood had taken their homelands, but it had also revealed new ones. Picture a group descending into a valley that had once been beneath ice. The soil is dark and rich, damp beneath their feet. The scent of wildflowers lingers in the air, mingling with the musk of animals newly returned. Herds of deer move through the meadows, their antlers catching the light of the setting sun. Birds wheel overhead, their cries sharp against the vast silence. The people walk cautiously, but their eyes are wide with wonder. This is no longer a world of endings, it is a world of beginnings. It was in this new world that the seeds of civilization took root. The trauma of the flood lingered in memory, shaping myth and ritual, but it also shaped practice. People no longer assumed the land would always provide. They had learned that what seemed eternal could vanish in an instant, and so they began to build differently. They planted crops not only to eat today, but to store for tomorrow. They built shelters not only to withstand the night, but to endure seasons. They mapped the rivers, studied the floods, learned to predict the rhythms of water. In this way, catastrophe became teacher. Out of loss came planning. Out of planning came permanence. Out of permanence came civilization. The sensory fabric of these early beginnings was thick with detail. The rough texture of clay, shaped into pots, baked hard by fire, their surfaces warm and smooth under the hand. The steady sound of grinding stones, turning grain into flour, the rhythm as constant as breath. The taste of bread, coarse and nutty, unlike any food their ancestors had ever known. The sight of the villages clustered on high ground, smoke rising in spirals above them, each hearth a declaration that humanity had not only survived but chosen to stay. And beneath it all, memory persisted. At night, beneath stars glimmering like sparks in a vast darkness, stories were told around the fire. Stories of when the sea rose higher than mountains, of when forests vanished in waves, of when only a handful was spared. These were not only myths, but warnings, reminders written in voice and flame. And each retelling was an act of rebirth, binding the past to the present, ensuring that what was nearly lost would not be forgotten. The rebirth of humanity was not uniform. Some groups settled by rivers and began farming. Others clung to the old ways of hunting and gathering, roaming forests and highlands. Some explored new coasts, learning to fish, to sail, to navigate waters that had once terrified them. Others moved deep inland, away from the memory of the sea. Each path was different, but all were bound by the same truth. The flood had marked them, had pressed them into change, had ensured they would never again be the same species that had walked the world before. Close your eyes and picture a settlement along the Euphrates. The air is warm, buzzing with insects. Children play by irrigation channels, their feet splashing in the cool water as it trickles through carved earth. Men and women bend low in fields of barley, their hands brushing against the stalks heavy with grain. The smell of baking bread drifts from hearths, mingling with the earthy scent of damp soil. In the distance, the river glimmers, steady and constant, but never entirely trusted, for even as it nourishes, it reminds them of what water can do. Civilization rose not in spite of the flood, but because of it. The Nile's floods taught cycles of planting. The Indus carried silt that made fields rich. The Yellow River, fierce and unpredictable, forced people to engineer dikes and canals, their ingenuity sharpened by necessity. Each river valley was both a gift and a reminder, its fertility inseparable from the trauma of water. The civilizations that rose here were children of the flood, their greatness born from the same force that had nearly erased them. The emotional landscape of rebirth was as complex as the physical one. There was joy in survival, in new life, in abundance, but there was also sorrow for lands left behind, for families lost, for worlds remembered only in dream and story. This mixture of grief and hope gave rise to something uniquely human, resilience woven with imagination. Out of sorrow came myths of drowned cities, of gods who spared a chosen few. Out of hope came temples, laws, songs, art, the building blocks of culture itself. The flood had tested humanity, and humanity had emerged tempered, like stone hardened by fire, stronger but scarred, wiser but marked by memory. This was not the same species that had walked the plains before. This was a new humanity, one that knew fragility, one that knew endurance, one that had been reborn from water. The sensory memory of this rebirth lingers even now. The shimmer of light on a river's surface, the sound of waves at night, steady and unending, the smell of damp earth after rain, the cool touch of stone carved into temples that still stand by ancient rivers. These sensations connect us to ancestors who rebuilt after the flood, who shaped civilization from loss. We carry their survival not only in our DNA, but in our daily lives, in every city, every harvest, every story we tell. And so, the flood did not end humanity, it remade it. Out of loss came resilience, out of disaster came innovation. The world after the flood was new, and so were we, a species reborn, forever shaped by water, forever carrying the memory of survival. Close your eyes once more, hear the murmur of a river, steady and calm, smell the smoke of a fire, drifting on cool evening air, feel the warmth of bread in your hands, its texture coarse but nourishing. Imagine voices telling stories under the stars, voices that have carried across millennia, voices that belong to you as much as to them. This is the rebirth of humanity, not a single moment, but an unfolding, a long dawn after a long night. The waters receded, but the lessons remained, and from those lessons civilization rose. Humanity had been nearly erased, instead it was remade. The flood is gone, but its shadow remains, not in the roar of water or the collapse of ice, but in the quiet places, in the stories whispered across cultures, in the stones carved with symbols of waves, in the instinctive awe we feel standing before the sea. Humanity carries that memory like a scar, invisible, yet shaping every step we take. What the waters tried to take was not only land, but certainty. In losing so much, we learned what it meant to endure. We became a people of memory, a people of invention, a people who could turn catastrophe into the seed of civilization. The fields we farm, the cities we build, the stories we tell, all of them flow from that ancient crucible of survival. The flood did not only test us, it revealed us. Close your eyes and imagine the shoreline at twilight. The tide rolls in with its endless rhythm, the air rich with salt, the horizon softened by fading light. Somewhere, deep within the waves, lie the drowned plains of Doggerland, the sunken valleys of the Sunda Shelf, the river deltas that once carried human laughter. They are gone, yet not forgotten, because we are their legacy. We are the children of survivors, carrying forward the fragile flame that water could not extinguish. And as the tide whispers against the rocks, another truth emerges. The flood is not just history, it is warning. Seas rise again, ice melts again, storms strengthen. The past is not gone, it waits, reflected in the world we now inhabit. The question that lingers, soft but insistent, is the same one carried for 12,000 years. Will we listen? Will we adapt once more? Or will we let the water take what memory tried so hard to preserve? The story of the flood is both an ending and a beginning, a reminder of our fragility and our resilience, our limits and our potential. It tells us that we can be nearly erased and still endure, that we can lose almost everything and still find a way to begin again. The waters receded, the world was remade, and so were we. Sleep well and remember, we are the descendants of those who walked through the flood, who rebuilt from silence, who carried the world back into light. Their story is our story. Their survival is our inheritance.